When we think of Rome, it is often the grand achievements that come to mind first. The aqueducts arching across valleys, the massive roads stretching in perfect lines for hundreds of miles, the great arenas filled with the roar of the crowd and the columns and arches that celebrated military victories with marble permanence. Rome has become a symbol of endurance, civilization that sought to carve its presence into the very landscape of history, one stone at a time. And yet, behind the marble and the monuments, there was another Rome, a Rome that was just as devoted to destroying as it was to building, to silencing as it was to proclaiming. This Rome understood something unsettling, something that still echoes with relevance for us today. That memory is not fixed, that history is not neutral, and that the past can be shaped and manipulated to serve the needs of power. To control memory was to control destiny. The Roman elite, from senators to emperors, grasped this truth with remarkable clarity, and they used it ruthlessly. They realized that memory itself could be weaponized. A person's reputation, a city's story, an entire people's legacy could be built up or torn down not only by the sword, but by the pen, the chisel, and the decree. In this way, Rome developed what may be one of the darkest and most sophisticated practices in history: the deliberate erasure of its enemies from collective memory. It was not enough to defeat a rival in life. One had to also defeat them in death, annihilating not only their body, but their very presence in the narrative of history. This practice became known in Latin as damnatio memoria, literally, the condemnation of memory. It was a phrase that carried an almost supernatural weight, for it did not just mean forgetting someone. It meant actively unmaking them, as though chiseling their existence out of the stone of reality itself. To suffer this fate was to endure the worst possible punishment in Roman eyes, worse even than exile, worse even than execution. Because while death ended the body, memory, if it was preserved, could grant a person a kind of immortality. Romans believed deeply in the power of fama, the legacy of one's deeds carried on by others. Generals who won great victories achieved immortality through monuments, coins, and poetry. Families preserved the memory of ancestors through wax masks. It's displayed in funeral processions, so the dead could march symbolically among the living. Poets like Virgil promised in their verses that Rome itself would live forever because its stories would never die. In such a culture, to be remembered was everything. To be erased was to be annihilated twice over, once in the body and once in the soul. And that is what damnatio memoria inflicted: a second, eternal death, one carried out not by nature, but by decree. The mechanics of this erasure were chilling in their precision. Once the Senate passed such a decree, the condemned's name was scratched out from inscriptions across the empire. Marble monuments were scarred, bronze plaques mutilated, statues were toppled, sometimes smashed into fragments, sometimes decapitated and recarved into the likeness of a new ruler. Coins bearing their image were seized and melted down, or else crudely defaced with gouges across the face. Histories were rewritten, their names omitted or replaced with silence. Even in public ritual, they were struck out. If their name was read during ceremonies, it would be blotted out, erased from the collective recitation that kept memory alive. The condemned became a ghost that could not be named. And for ordinary Romans who walked past these defaced inscriptions, the message was unmistakable. This person has been judged unworthy of memory itself. Forgetting them was not merely allowed, it was required. This reveals to us something profound about the Roman mind. They understood that memory is power. To allow a rival to be remembered was to risk giving them a voice even after death. To erase them was to ensure that future generations would never know them, never draw inspiration, never question why they were condemned. In this way, memory became another weapon in Rome's arsenal, alongside legions and laws. The erasures created silences, and in those silences, Rome could write its own version of truth. But silences are never truly empty. They whisper, they linger, they leave scars that can still be seen on ancient stones. And it is in those scars that we, centuries later, glimpse the dark secret at the heart of Rome's greatness. That much of its permanence was built on deliberate forgetting. To fully grasp why the Romans placed such immense value on memory, and why its destruction carried such a terrifying weight, we must look at the cultural foundation of Roman society. Unlike our modern world, where the individual often defines themselves through personal identity, career, or inner belief, the Romans lived in a society where one's worth was measured by how they were remembered by others. A Roman statesman did not seek glory for private satisfaction, but for the fama, the reputation that would ensure his name endured across generations. To be praised by poets, to be honored by inscriptions, to be carved into stone as a benefactor of the city. These were the ambitions that drove the political elite. Even ordinary Roman families held tight to this principle. The tradition of imagines. The wax death masks of ancestors displayed in the household was not merely about mourning, it was about keeping the dead alive in memory. At funerals, these masks were worn by actors who represented the ancestors, so that the lineage could march again before the eyes of the living. The message was clear. The greatest victory was to never be forgotten. Immortality in Rome was not secured by the soul ascending to paradise, but by the name being kept alive through collective remembrance. Thus, when an emperor or the Senate chose to erase someone, they were not simply punishing them. They were robbing them of the very essence of Roman immortality. The threat of erasure also functioned as a powerful political deterrent. To rebel against the emperor, to betray the Senate, or to attempt a coup was not simply to risk death, but to risk being expunged from history itself. Your children might inherit your wealth if you fell in battle, but they could not inherit your honor if your name was condemned. Whole families bore the scars of damnatio memoria, the official but often unofficial erasure of individuals from public memory. Sons and daughters would walk past defaced monuments, knowing that their father's name had once stood there before it was deliberately scraped away. Imagine the psychological weight of living under such a curse, where your very lineage had been stripped of its legitimacy. In this way, Rome's weaponization of memory extended far beyond the individual. It destabilized families, clans, and entire factions. The stain of erasure was not confined to one person, it spread across generations, a shadow that could not easily be lifted. But the Romans also understood that memory could not be controlled by decree alone. They recognized that stories, gossip, poetry, and rumor could keep the condemned alive in dangerous ways. And so, the machinery of erasure had to be comprehensive. Historians who lived under the empire often wrote with an acute awareness of the danger of remembering too much. Tacitus, one of Rome's most celebrated historians, wrote with a style that often hinted at what he could not openly say, leaving gaps, silences, and sharp criticisms cloaked in subtle language. Others simply omitted certain figures entirely, as though they had never existed. Even poets were not safe. Ovid, for example, though not condemned to damnatio memoria, was exiled by Augustus for offending the emperor, and his works were nearly lost because of their dangerous associations. Rome's rulers understood that cultural memory was more slippery than stone inscriptions. It lived in art, in performance, in stories passed from mouth to mouth. To erase an enemy required vigilance across every medium of remembrance. And yet, ironically, it is in these scars and silences that we today can see Rome most clearly. When we walk through museums and see inscriptions where names have been violently scratched away, we are confronted with the raw evidence of memory's manipulation. The absence itself tells a story, often louder than the words that remain. It reveals a society obsessed with its image, terrified of dissent, and committed to shaping its own narrative at all costs. Modern historians, by piecing together these absences, construct not only the lives of the condemned, but also the psychology of Rome itself. For what a society chooses to remember is telling, but what it chooses to forget is even more revealing. In the Roman case, those choices expose a culture where power was not content with defeating enemies in battle. It demanded their obliteration from memory, ensuring that even their ghosts would be denied a voice in the future. Rome's obsession with controlling memory reflects the empire's relationship with time itself. Romans were acutely conscious of the past and its power to legitimize the present. Every senator, general, or emperor justified his authority not simply by pointing to his own achievements, but by invoking the long line of Roman greatness that came before him. When Augustus, Rome's first emperor, consolidated power, he did so not by rejecting the Republic outright, but by carefully presenting himself as its savior, as the heir of traditions stretching back centuries. He commissioned monuments like the Era Pacis, the Altar of Peace, which depicted Rome's continuity with its ancestral virtues. He filled his reign with references to the mythic founding by Romulus, the heroic age of Aeneas, and the discipline of early republican figures. History was not an abstract record of facts. It was a living tool, used to justify political legitimacy. In such a system, to erase an enemy was to rewrite the lineage of authority, cutting out an inconvenient branch and presenting a smooth, unbroken tree of destiny. The past was curated so that the present would appear inevitable. Rome's rulers understood that if you control what people believe about yesterday, you control what they accept about today. This is why damnatio memoria was not simply about vengeance or pettiness, though both surely played their parts. It was a deeply strategic maneuver. By erasing rivals, emperors and senators could claim continuity, stability, and even divine approval. Consider how dangerous it would have been to admit that an emperor had been assassinated because he was hated, corrupt, or tyrannical. Such an admission would undermine the sacred aura of Roman authority. Instead, the official story often went something like this. The man in question was a villain who had betrayed Rome's values, and his removal was an act of purification. By erasing his memory, Rome was not only punishing him, but also cleansing itself of his stain. In this way, erasure became an act of self-preservation for the state. The past was rewritten to reassure the people that Rome remained eternal, unshaken, and righteous. The scars left on inscriptions were less about forgetting than about teaching a lesson. Rome corrects itself, purges corruption, and continues unbroken. Yet we must not mistake this for total success. Memory is stubborn, and silence has a way of echoing louder than words. You see this paradox in many of the condemned figures of Roman history. Take, for instance, the Emperor Domitian, who ruled in the late 1st century CE. After his assassination, the Senate condemned his memory, toppled his statues, and defaced his name wherever it appeared. And yet, precisely because his erasure was so thorough, later writers could not help but remark upon it. Suetonius, a biographer of the emperors, describes the Senate's eagerness to erase Domitian with almost glee. Tacitus, more subtle, treats Domitian as a silent presence lurking in the background of his histories. Far from disappearing, Domitian survived as a ghost of memory, preserved precisely by the violence done to his legacy. The attempt to silence him ensured that the silence itself became part of the record. This is the paradox of erasure. The harder you try to destroy a name, the more you leave behind traces of its absence. The same holds true for countless others. We know of Sejanus, the powerful praetorian prefect under Tiberius, largely because of the ferocity with which he was erased after his fall from power. We know of Geta, the brother of Caracalla, because his image was hacked out of family portraits with such dramatic violence that the mutilated reliefs themselves have become famous. These figures might otherwise have slipped into obscurity if not for the dramatic scars of their erasure. In trying to obliterate them, Rome accidentally immortalized them, and this raises a disturbing thought. For every Sejanus or Geta we can identify, how many more were erased without leaving such visible scars? How many generals, senators, rebels, or entire communities have been lost forever because their memory was condemned and successfully obliterated? The truth is, we will never know, and that is the most chilling success of Rome's strategy. The countless silent absences that can no longer be reconstructed. Across ancient Rome, the evidence of this systematic erasure still haunts the physical remains of Rome, whispering to us through the scars carved into stone and bronze. Walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum, or into the galleries of museums across Europe, and you will encounter inscriptions where whole lines of text have been crudely scratched away, leaving behind a rough gouge where once a proud name stood. These absences are not accidents of erosion or the carelessness of time. They are deliberate wounds, inflicted by human hands at the command of the state. A triumphal arch, designed to glorify victory, might suddenly appear incomplete, its dedication mutilated. A statue, once carefully sculpted to immortalize a man's features, might stand decapitated, the head replaced with the likeness of his successor. Even coins, Rome's most widespread propaganda tools, show traces of this obsession. Faces scratched out, legends hammered into illegibility. These objects remind us that history itself was being rewritten at the most intimate level. Empire's power extended into every corner of daily life, not only in how people lived, but in how they remembered or were forced to forget. This practice also reveals something essential about the Roman conception of truth. In our modern world, we often imagine truth as fixed, an objective reality waiting to be discovered. But for the Romans, truth was something constructed, something proclaimed by authority and reinforced by ritual. If the Senate decreed that a man was unworthy of memory, then in a sense it became true. Because the instruments of public life, monuments, coins, festivals, histories, were aligned to make it so. Truth was not what happened, but what was remembered. And what was remembered was decided by those who held power. This is why the Romans invested so much effort in shaping memory. To control the narrative was to control reality. The citizen walking past a scarred inscription was not just seeing an absence. They were seeing the Senate's declaration that this absence was correct, that this forgetting was justice. In such a world, to resist erasure was not simply an act of remembrance, but an act of rebellion. And yet, despite the reach of official decrees, human memory is a stubborn thing. People talk, they whisper, they remember in secret what they cannot say aloud in public. We can imagine Roman households where parents quietly told their children about the man whose name had been scratched away, about the events that the state demanded they forget. In this way, private memory resisted public erasure, creating a tension between what was officially sanctioned and what was personally recalled. This is part of why we still know about many of the condemned today, not because Rome intended it, but because memory has a way of surviving even under oppression. But the risk of remembering was real. To speak the name of the condemned in the wrong company could be dangerous, even fatal. Silence was safer. And so, gradually, across generations, the state's version of history took deeper root. Those who dared to remember were replaced by those who had no living memory at all, and the silence became permanent. The long-term result was a Roman history that is both abundant and strangely hollow. We have thousands of inscriptions, monuments, coins, and texts, yet within them we encounter gaps, absences, names that should be there but are missing. These voids are not empty, they are full of meaning, telling us about the deliberate shaping of the past. They remind us that Rome's greatness was not simply built on conquest and construction, but also on manipulation and silence. It is no coincidence that modern regimes, from medieval kingdoms to 20th century dictatorships, have imitated Rome's practices of erasing names, rewriting records, and controlling memory. Rome established the blueprint. By understanding how Rome wielded this weapon, we come to understand how fragile memory truly is, and how history is never merely the past, it is always the contested ground of power. Rome was a city that never forgot, or rather it was a city that made sure it never remembered certain things. The danger of Rome's manipulation of memory lies in the way it blurred the line between fact and narrative. For the average Roman citizen, there was no independent archive to consult. No university library where all accounts were preserved for comparison. Knowledge came through what was carved in stone, recited in ritual, and reported by state-sanctioned historians. If the Senate declared a man's memory condemned and his name removed, then to the ordinary Roman he had effectively ceased to exist. Over time, the absence itself became normal. A young man born after the erasure of an emperor or general might grow up never knowing that this figure had once shaped the destiny of the empire. The scarred stone in the forum would mean nothing to him beyond being an odd curiosity. This gradual fading of memory demonstrates the chilling effectiveness of damnatio memoria. It was not about erasing the past in an instant. It was about ensuring that future generations would never know it had existed at all. And once a generation no longer remembers, the silence becomes the only truth. This has deep implications for how we, centuries later, try to reconstruct Rome's history. We depend on fragments, on clues, on the accidents of survival. A defaced coin that somehow escaped the melting furnace, an inscription that was scratched out imperfectly, leaving behind faint outlines of a name, a hostile historian who dared to allude to the condemned, even while avoiding their full story. From these scattered traces, we attempt to piece together the fuller picture. But we must always ask ourselves, how much is missing? How many entire stories were successfully erased, leaving no trace at all? The chilling answer is that we can never know. The history of Rome, as we inherit it, is not only a record of what happened, but also of what was allowed to be remembered. It is a curated version of the past, sculpted by political power and polished by centuries of repetition. In this way, Rome still controls its own narrative, even from the grave. Consider, too, how this manipulation of memory shaped the psychology of empire. Citizens were taught to trust the official narrative, to accept that what was absent deserved to be absent. Over time, this conditioned a population to think of Rome as flawless, destined, eternal. Defeats were reframed as temporary setbacks. Tyrants were erased as though they had never ruled, and dissenters were silenced into oblivion. The Roman people were not simply subjects of an empire, they were participants in a grand performance of memory, where remembering and forgetting were acts of loyalty. To remember what the state had erased could mark you as dangerous, even subversive. Forgetting became patriotic. And so, even the very act of memory was politicized, transformed into a test of allegiance. In such a world, history was not a neutral record, but an active battlefield where silence itself was a weapon. This understanding of memory as power did not vanish with Rome. Later rulers in Europe, from medieval kings to modern dictators, learned from Rome's example. To destroy statues, to censor books, to erase names from public life, all these practices trace their roots back to the Roman genius for controlling memory. What Rome pioneered became a template for future regimes. Even today, when we speak of rewriting history, we echo a practice that Rome perfected 2,000 years ago. This continuity is both sobering and instructive. It reminds us that history is never simply given to us. It is always mediated, always filtered, always vulnerable to the interests of those who hold power. And so, as we examine Rome's obsession with erasure, we are not merely looking at an ancient curiosity, we are staring into a mirror that reflects patterns of human behavior across millennia. Rome's dark secret is also humanity's, the persistent urge to control memory, to silence inconvenient truths, to shape the past in order to secure the present. To grasp the full weight of Rome's obsession with erasing memory, we must also recognize how it functioned as a form of control over identity. In the Roman world, a person's name was not just a label but a vessel of honor, reputation, and existence. Names were carved into stone to declare triumphs, inscribed on dedications to gods, minted on coins that traveled across continents. To possess a name in Rome was to possess a kind of immortality, because it ensured that long after the body had decayed, the memory of the individual endured. This is why Roman aristocrats were so fixated on ancestry and lineage. Their ancestors' names decorated family shrines, were paraded during public festivals, and were recited with reverence at funerals. To belong to such a chain of memory was to belong to history itself. Now imagine the horror, then, of having that name deliberately hacked away, erased from inscriptions, omitted from records. It was a second death, one more complete than physical death, because it targeted the soul's place in eternity. This was the cruel genius of damnatio memoria. It did not only punish the condemned, it annihilated their identity. What makes this system even more striking is that it was not reserved solely for the wicked or the universally despised. Of course, tyrants and traitors could expect to be erased. Sometimes, the condemned were figures whose only true crime was falling out of favor with those in power. A rival general whose popularity threatened the emperor, a senator who spoke too freely against imperial policies, an empress accused of scandal, whether real or fabricated. Their names, once celebrated, could be obliterated overnight. In this way, erasure functioned as a political weapon, allowing those at the top to rewrite not only the story of the empire, but also the reputations of their enemies. It was not enough to defeat them politically. One had to ensure that posterity itself would never remember them with respect, or perhaps never remember them at all. Yet, despite this brutality, the practice also reveals the fragility of power. If Rome had been confident in its authority, it would not have needed to erase names. The fact that emperors and senators resorted to damnatio memoria shows their deep anxiety about legacy, about how posterity might judge them. They feared that their enemies' memories might endure, that future generations might look back and admire those who opposed them. By scratching away a name, they hoped to extinguish not only dissent in the present, but also admiration in the future. In this sense, every erased inscription is a confession of insecurity, sign that Rome's rulers recognized the dangerous power of memory. They understood that history is not only about the past, it is also a resource for the future. To allow their enemies to live on in memory was to risk inspiring new enemies, new rebels, new rivals. Better then, to silence the memory altogether. For us today, these erasures are both frustrating and illuminating. They frustrate us because they leave gaps in the historical record, preventing us from knowing fully the lives and deeds of figures who once mattered. But they also illuminate the psychology of power in ancient Rome. They show us a civilization that prided itself on its monuments, its grandeur, its eternal city, yet was deeply vulnerable to the power of remembrance. Rome sought immortality through stone and marble, yet feared that the same tools could immortalize those it despised. The paradox is clear. An empire that wanted to last forever was obsessed with forgetting. To study this paradox is to uncover one of the deepest truths about Ramnat, that it was merely a civilization of conquest and administration, but that it was a civilization of memory, constantly constructing, revising, and erasing its own story. As we conclude this first exploration into Rome's manipulation of memory, it is worth pausing to reflect on what this practice reveals about the empire's relationship with truth and history. Rome, for all its power and grandeur, understood something profoundly unsettling, that the past is never secure. The past, once thought immutable, can in fact be reshaped, rewritten, or silenced entirely. This is why damnatio memoria was not merely a punishment but a strategy, one woven into the very fabric of governance. By erasing names, defacing monuments, and rewriting official accounts, Rome demonstrated that history is not a neutral chronicle of events. It is a battlefield. On this battlefield, victories were won not only with legions and swords, but with chisels and silence. The weapon of memory could be just as devastating as the weapon of war. The citizens who walked past scarred inscriptions may have thought themselves living in the aftermath of justice, when in fact they were living in the midst of manipulation. Their reality was carefully curated, their understanding of the past filtered through the deliberate choices of power. This realization forces us to ask difficult questions about how we, centuries later, approach Rome's legacy. We rely on the records that survive, yet those records were never neutral in the first place. They were shaped by victors, polished by propagandists, and edited by censors. Every name we do not know, every story that remains untold, is a reminder of Rome's success in controlling memory. And yet, paradoxically, the very act of erasure has left its own trail. The blank spaces carved into stone, the scarred inscriptions, the missing heads of statues, these absences speak loudly. They remind us that there was once something, or someone, there to be erased. In this way, Rome's attempt to silence its enemies becomes evidence of their existence. The absence itself testifies to the violence of forgetting. For modern historians, these scars are as telling as any intact monument, for they reveal not just what Rome celebrated, but what Rome feared. The persistence of these traces teaches us another lesson. Erasure is never complete. Rome may have silenced the voices of its enemies in its own time, but fragments endure, waiting to be pieced together. Inscriptions once scratched out can sometimes be reconstructed with modern technology. Ancient authors who dared to hint at condemned figures provide us with whispers of their lives. Even gossip, preserved in later writings, can give us clues. Memory, though fragile, resists annihilation. It survives in the most unlikely places, in the reverse side of a coin, in a phrase overlooked by censors, in the faint etching of a name that a chisel could not fully remove. And so, while Rome was skilled in the art of forgetting, it was never perfect. Its dark secret is not only that it erased, but also that it failed to erase completely. As we move forward into the next segments, we will encounter concrete examples of this practice, exploring how individual figures, emperors, generals, and even ordinary citizens were subjected to this fate. We will see how their memories were condemned, how their names were stripped away, and how, despite Rome's efforts, echoes of their lives continue to reach us across the centuries. But before we leave this introduction, let us hold on to one key idea. that history is not a passive record, but an active construction. Rome shows us that the stories we inherit are never the full story. They are the stories that survived, the stories that were permitted, the stories that were not erased. To understand Rome is to look not only at what is remembered, but at what is missing. And in those absences we find the true power of memory. Rome's greatness was not only built on the battles it won, but on the memories it controlled. To forget this is, in a way, to allow Rome's strategy to succeed even now. To understand the mechanics of Rome's erasure of enemies, we must move from theory into practice. From abstract ideas about memory to the flesh and blood lives of those who were condemned. The scars carved into stone and the silences in the historical record are not accidents. They are the remains of deliberate campaigns waged against individuals who, for a time, stood at the center of power. Some of these figures were emperors themselves, rulers who ascended to the throne only to be condemned after their deaths. Others were powerful senators, generals, or advisors who threatened the delicate balance of imperial politics. Still others were family members of emperors, wives or sons whose mere existence became inconvenient. By examining these case studies, we begin to see not only how damnatio memoria worked in practice, but also the anxieties that drove it. Each erasure tells a story not just about the victim, but about the rulers who ordered it. Perhaps the most notorious example is the Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE. Domitian was, by most accounts, a capable administrator and an ambitious builder. He strengthened the empire's defenses, reformed the coinage, and completed some of Rome's most enduring monuments, including major expansions to the Colosseum. Yet he was also accused of cruelty, paranoia, and autocratic excess. After his assassination in 96 CE, the Senate declared his memory condemned. His statues were torn down or recarved, his name erased from inscriptions, and his official portraits destroyed. The speed and intensity of this erasure revealed just how much the Senate despised him. But they also illustrate the mechanics of Rome's attempt to control memory. By blotting out Domitian's name, the Senate sought to present him not as a fallen emperor, but as an unperson, someone who had forfeited even the right to be remembered. And yet, ironically, this very act preserved his notoriety. Today we remember Domitian, not despite damnatio memoria, but because of it. His absence is too conspicuous, his erasure too thorough to escape notice. Another telling case is that of Sejanus, the powerful advisor to Emperor Tiberius in the early 1st century CE. For years, Sejanus controlled access to the emperor, commanded the Praetorian Guard, and appeared destined for supreme power. Accumulated statues in his honor, dedications praising his name, and public ceremonies that treated him almost as co-ruler. But when Tiberius turned against him in 31 CE, Sejanus was executed, and his memory was condemned with brutal efficiency. His statues were smashed, his name struck out from inscriptions, and his reputation recast as that of a traitor. What makes Sejanus's case especially fascinating is how quickly his image shifted. One day he was the most powerful man in Rome, honored with titles and public devotion. The next, he was an enemy of the state, erased from monuments, his family executed, his name transformed into a cautionary tale. This whiplash demonstrates the fragility of power in Rome, where memory could turn from exaltation to erasure overnight. These examples underscore an essential truth. Rome's obsession with memory was deeply tied to its politics of fear. Erasure was not only punishment for the condemned, but a warning to the living. When citizens saw Domitian's statues defaced or Sejanus's name removed, they were reminded of the fate that awaited those who fell from grace. Memory was a spectacle, a theater of power where forgetting became a performance as visible as any triumph. In this sense, damnatio memoria was never just about the past. It was about disciplining the present, told senators, generals, and even ordinary citizens that the empire could not only take their lives but also their legacies. To oppose Rome, or to oppose the emperor, was to risk not only death, but oblivion. And in a culture where remembrance was tied to immortality, oblivion was the ultimate punishment. Take, for instance, the notorious Emperor Nero, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's reign from 54 to 68 CE is remembered today through tales of extravagance, cruelty, and the Great Fire of Rome. Ancient sources accuse him of murdering his own mother, Agrippina, persecuting Christians, and indulging in artistic performances that scandalized the senatorial elite. Whether or not all of these accusations were true, they shaped his posthumous reputation as one of Rome's most hated emperors. After his suicide in 68 CE, the Senate declared him a public enemy, and in the chaotic civil wars that followed, his memory was aggressively targeted. Statues of Nero were toppled, inscriptions bearing his name were altered, and attempts were made to sever his image from the grandeur of the imperial line. Yet Nero's erasure was never entirely successful. For many among the common people, he remained a figure of fascination, even of admiration. We know from historical accounts that false Neros impostors, claiming to be the dead emperor, emerged in the eastern provinces, gaining followings from those who believed the emperor still lived. This strange phenomenon illustrates the limits of damnatio memoria. Rome could strike his name from monuments, but it could not extinguish the memory of him in the popular imagination. Nero's legend persisted, fed by both fear and fascination, a ghost haunting the empire long after his death. Nero's case also highlights the paradox of erasure. The more aggressively Rome tried to obliterate his legacy, the more attention was drawn to him. The defaced statues and altered inscriptions became silent reminders that something was missing, that a name had been intentionally removed. This, in turn, provoked curiosity, forcing people to ask, who was this man, and why was he erased? In trying to destroy his memory, Rome inadvertently immortalized him in a new way, ensuring that future generations would remember him precisely as the figure who was too monstrous or too dangerous to be remembered. And indeed, Nero's legacy remains one of the most enduring of all Roman emperors. His erasure failed not because Rome lacked power, but because memory, once unleashed, is nearly impossible to cage. The stories of his tyranny spread far beyond the boundaries of monuments or inscriptions. They survived in gossip and whispers, in the fearful awe of a population that could not stop talking about the emperor they were told to forget. Another case worth considering is that of Geta, the younger son of Emperor Septimius Severus. After Severus's death in 211 CE, Geta ruled jointly with his brother Caracalla. Their relationship was hostile from the beginning, and within a year, Caracalla orchestrated Geta's murder during a supposed reconciliation meeting, stabbing him in the arms of their mother, Julia Dumna. Following the murder, Caracalla initiated a sweeping campaign of damnatio memoria against his brother. Statues of Geta were destroyed or recarved, inscriptions were altered, and his image was violently scratched out from public monuments. The erasure was so thorough that in many surviving reliefs, we see awkward gaps where Geta's figure once stood, replaced by empty space or hastily reworked imagery. Even portraits of their father, Septimius Severus, were altered. In the famous Severan Tondo, painted family portrait, Geta's face was deliberately scraped away, leaving only a void where he once appeared. Few examples show as clearly as this how erasure extended into the personal and familial, transforming family portraits into acts of political violence. Geta's case demonstrates how damnatio memoria was not just about public justice, but about consolidating power. For Caracalla, killing his brother was not enough. He needed to erase him from memory so completely that no one could rally around his name. The empty spaces left in monuments were a constant reminder of Caracalla's dominance, a visual warning to anyone who might dare to remember Geta fondly. And yet, just as with Nero, the attempt at erasure only ensured Geta's survival in history. The violence of erasure leaves its own kind of permanence, one that Rome could never fully control. When we think of Rome's erasures, our minds often turn to emperors, generals, and male politicians, yet women, too, were targets of this calculated forgetting. In Rome, imperial women carried immense symbolic power. They represented dynastic continuity, moral virtue, and the sacred household of the emperor. A wife, mother, or sister of an emperor was more than family. She was an emblem of the regime itself. To celebrate her was to celebrate the dynasty. To condemn her was to weaken or erase it. This made women especially vulnerable to damnatio memoria, for their identities were inseparably tied to the political fortunes of the men around them. When dynasties fell, or emperors sought to cleanse their reputations, women's memories were among the first to be sacrificed. Their portraits were defaced, their names struck from inscriptions, and their roles minimized or rewritten. In the silence that followed, these women, many of them influential behind the scenes, were reduced to shadows, remembered only through hostile accounts or in the absence of their erased likenesses. One striking example is Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero and wife of Emperor Claudius. Agrippina wielded immense influence in her lifetime. As the great-granddaughter of Augustus, she represented the continuity of the Julio-Claudian line, and her marriage to Claudius solidified her power at court. She was portrayed in coins alongside Claudius, her image elevated to near-requel prominence, something almost unprecedented for a woman in Rome. Yet her downfall came at the hands of her own son, Nero. After orchestrating her murder in 59 CE, Nero worked to diminish her memory, stripping away the honors she had accumulated and ensuring her image faded from public monuments. The erasure of Agrippina's memory reveals the precarious position of imperial women. They could be celebrated as goddesses of virtue one day, only to be vilified and forgotten the next. Agrippina's political ambition, once praised as dynastic loyalty, was recast as dangerous overreach. Her erasure served Nero not only by eliminating a rival figure of authority, but also by rewriting his own legitimacy, transforming himself from the son of a powerful mother into the sole architect of Rome's destiny. Another victim of erasure was Crispina, wife of Emperor Commodus in the late 2nd century CE, married young into the imperial household. Crispina was initially honored as Augusta, her portraits minted on coins, and her name inscribed and dedicated. But when her relationship with Commodus soured, she was accused of adultery, a charge often leveled against women of the imperial court when they fell out of favor. She was exiled and eventually executed, and her memory condemned. Statues of Crispina were reworked or destroyed, and her name carefully excised from inscriptions. This pattern was typical. Women were not always erased for crimes of their own making, but for the political necessity of their husbands or brothers. Their erasure served as tools of consolidation, cleansing the dynasty's image by eliminating figures who no longer served its purposes. In Crispina's case, her removal also highlighted Commodus's increasing paranoia and instability, as even his closest family members were not safe from his suspicion. What these cases reveal is that the erasure of women carried a unique dimension. While men were condemned primarily for political rivalry or tyranny, women were often erased to shore up male authority or cleanse dynastic scandals. Their memories were fragile because their public roles were symbolic, and symbols are easily destroyed. Yet, just as with their male counterparts, erasure was never complete. Agrippina's story survived in the writings of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, albeit in hostile tones. Crispina's coins, though rare, still circulate in collections today, whispering of her brief role as empress. These remnants resist the silence Rome tried to impose, reminding us that memory, even when violently suppressed, has a way of enduring. And in this endurance lies a profound irony. The very women Rome sought to erase remain visible to us, precisely because the violence done to their memory makes their absence conspicuous. Their shadows linger in history's gaps, silent yet undeniable. While individual emperors, advisors, and empresses often bore the brunt of damnatio memoria, Rome also turned its weapon of forgetting against entire families and dynasties. These campaigns of erasure were broader, were sweeping, and often more devastating than those aimed at individuals, because they sought not merely to punish one person, but to blot out whole bloodlines from history. By destroying the memory of a family, the ruling powers attempted to erase potential claimants to the throne, weaken rival factions, and present the ruling dynasty as the sole legitimate bearer of Rome's destiny. Such acts of collective forgetting remind us that memory in Rome was not simply personal, it was dynastic, familial, and deeply political. The fate of an emperor's family could determine how his reign would be remembered or condemned. The scars of erasure reveal the intensity of these struggles for power. The Flavian dynasty offers one of the clearest examples. Founded by Vespasian, after the chaos of the year of the four emperors 69 CE, the Flavians Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian brought stability to Rome, completing monumental projects such as the Colosseum. Yet their legacy was fractured. Especially after Domitian's assassination in 96 CE, the Senate condemned Domitian's memory with particular ferocity, striking his name from inscriptions and tearing down his statues. But the campaign did not end with him. In condemning Domitian, the Senate effectively tainted the Flavian dynasty as a whole, framing it as corrupt and tyrannical. In public memory, Vespasian and Titus were allowed to remain celebrated, but only in ways that emphasized the contrast with Domitian's alleged monstrosity. The dynasty was remembered selectively, its final representative silenced in order to cast the first two in a more favorable light. This selective forgetting demonstrates how erasure can reshape entire lineages, elevating some members while obliterating others. The Severan dynasty provides another striking case. Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211 CE, sought to secure his dynasty's memory by promoting a strong image of his family. He elevated his wife Julia Domna to unprecedented prominence, gave his sons Caracalla and Geta positions of power, and filled Rome with portraits of the imperial household. Yet the fratricide of 211 shattered this image. Caracalla murdered Geta and initiated a ruthless campaign of erasure against his brother. But this was not just the erasure of one man. It was the systematic rewriting of the Severan dynasty. Portraits and reliefs showing the imperial family were mutilated, Geta's image scraped away. The Severan Tondo, a painted panel that once depicted Septimius Severus, Julia Domna, Caracalla, and Geta remains, one of the most haunting pieces of evidence. Geta's face is literally obliterated, replaced by a blank space. This single act of artistic violence turned a family portrait into a propaganda tool, recasting the dynasty as Caracallus alone. The erasure was a message to Rome. Only one Severan son would be remembered, and the other would be consigned to oblivion. Even later dynasties fell victim to these cycles. The Gordian family of the 3rd century, briefly elevated to imperial power during one of Rome's most turbulent periods, saw their memory violently contested after their downfall. Some emperors attempted to erase them from monuments, while others restored their names, showing how memory itself became a political currency. To erase a family was to delegitimize its claims. To restore it was to appropriate its prestige for oneself. This back and forth reveals how fragile dynastic memory truly was, dependent not on deeds alone, but on the favor or disfavor of those who ruled afterward. What unites these dynastic erasures is the reminder that Rome's memory was never neutral. Families were not remembered simply because of their contributions to the empire, but because of the political usefulness of their memory. The Flavians were remembered selectively. The Severans were mutilated into a story of one surviving son, while the Gordians were alternately erased and restored depending on who held power. In all these cases, the truth of history was less important than the narrative Rome's rulers wanted to project. And in these narratives, forgetting was as powerful a tool as remembering. By silencing families, Rome shaped its past into a mirror of its present, ensuring that history itself served the needs of the ruling order. But beyond individuals and dynasties, Rome also extended its culture of erasure to entire events, especially those that tarnished its carefully crafted image of strength, invincibility, and destiny. For an empire that prided itself on conquest, the acknowledgement of failure was more than an embarrassment. It was a potential fracture in the ideological armor that kept its citizens obedient and its enemies fearful. Rome's historians, monuments, and official records were all marshaled to suppress or soften accounts of military disasters, political humiliations, or diplomatic blunders that threatened to undermine the myth of Roman supremacy. What we see again and again is a deliberate reshaping of memory so that defeats either disappeared altogether or were reframed as temporary setbacks on the path to inevitable Roman victory. One of the most notorious examples of this tendency is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 09 CE, when 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The scale of the disaster was immense. Tens of thousands of soldiers slaughtered, Rome's prestige in the region shattered. And Augustus himself said to have wandered his palace crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." Yet Rome's official response was one of silence and erasure. No triumphs were declared, no monuments erected to honor the fallen. Instead, the event was quietly buried. Mentioned sparingly in later histories but conspicuously absent from the celebratory narratives that dominated imperial propaganda. To remember Teutoburg was to remember that Rome could be defeated, and so Rome chose to forget. This pattern repeated itself across centuries. The humiliating defeats suffered by Crassus at Caria in 53 BCE against the Parthians were minimized. Despite the catastrophic loss of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers and the capture of legionary standards, the disaster might have rivaled Teutoburg in infamy, yet Roman authors often glossed over it, preferring instead to highlight later victories against the Parthians under Augustus, who made a great show of recovering the captured standards through diplomacy. By reframing the narrative, Rome transformed a disaster into a symbol of imperial resilience, as if the humiliation had never truly mattered. The erasure here was subtle, not a complete silence, but a calculated rebalancing of memory, ensuring that defeat was overshadowed by eventual triumph. Even civil wars, which tore Rome apart, were subjected to this selective remembering and forgetting. When Augustus emerged victorious from his brutal struggle against Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the official story became one of Rome saving itself from Eastern decadence and tyranny. The bloody reality that Romans had slaughtered one another in unprecedented numbers was minimized, erased, or cloaked in euphemism. The victory at Actium in 31 BCE was celebrated endlessly, while the civil strife that preceded it faded from official memory. Similarly, during later crises of the 3rd century, when emperors fell in rapid succession and Rome's borders collapsed, official inscriptions and coins downplayed the chaos, emphasizing, instead, restored peace, eternal victory, and the strength of the emperor. In reality, Rome was fighting for its life, but its propaganda erased that vulnerability. These acts of erasing or reframing events show us that Rome's manipulation of memory was not confined to statues or names. It extended to the very timeline of history itself. By suppressing defeats, Rome maintained the illusion of unbroken triumph, which was essential to its identity as a world-conquering power. Citizens needed to believe in Rome's invincibility. Soldiers needed to believe their sacrifices contributed to a greater destiny. To admit otherwise was dangerous. Forgetting became a form of self-preservation, not just for the rulers, but for the empire as a whole. The silences in Rome's history, the battles we do not read about, the humiliations barely mentioned speak as loudly as the triumphs carved in stone. Rome's greatest secret was that its memory was not a mirror of reality, but a curated display, carefully edited to project strength and suppress weakness. And in this curated memory, entire events vanished, leaving behind only the myth of eternal victory. I'm the author of a book on the forgotten history of the Roman Empire.
When we step back and look at these examples, a clear pattern emerges. Rome's use of forgetting was systemic, not incidental. It was not merely a punishment doled out in moments of rage or vengeance. It was an ingrained instrument of governance, woven into the very fabric of imperial rule. The consistency with which memory was manipulated across centuries shows us that erasure was not the exception but the rule. By controlling what was remembered, Rome controlled the very boundaries of reality, shaping how citizens understood their past, their present, and their future. To be Roman was to live in a world where history itself was curated by the state. Consider how these erasures functioned across different scales. On the personal level, the Senate could condemn an emperor-like Domitian, ensuring his image was scraped from monuments and his name cursed in public rituals. On the familial level, Caracal's erasure of Geta distorted the memory of an entire dynasty, transforming a once shared legacy into a narrative of solitary rule. On the collective level, Rome's silence around disasters like Teutoburg or Carrhae prevented these defeats from undermining the mythology of Roman invincibility. Each level reinforced the other. To forget a brother was to forget a family. To forget a family was to forget a dynasty. To forget a defeat was to preserve the empire's illusion of eternal strength. Forgetting was hierarchical, rippling outward until it enveloped the entire culture. The machinery of forgetting was also practical. Erasure gave rulers a tool to neutralize rivals long after their physical deaths. An emperor could not be resurrected once assassinated, but his memory could live on as a rallying point for dissent. To remove statues, inscriptions, or accounts was to deny him even the afterlife of remembrance, making him not only politically dead, but socially invisible. For dynasties, the obliteration of an unwanted member secured the legitimacy of those who remained, tightening the narrative so that inconvenient truths, fratricide, incompetence, or scandal were buried beneath the silence. For Rome as a whole, suppressing humiliating events allowed the empire to project itself as unbreakable, sustaining the collective belief that Rome was destined to rule the world. This belief was not merely ideology, it was the foundation of Roman authority. The effectiveness of this system depended on Rome's control over the mediums of memory. Monuments, inscriptions, coinage, and histories. These were the vehicles through which the past was transmitted, and Rome understood that to edit them was to edit memory itself. Coins could be reminted, bearing new faces. Monuments could be rededicated, their original honorees erased. Histories could be commissioned, guiding how future generations would interpret events. Ordinary people had little say in what was remembered because memory was a privilege of power. The very tools that created public identity were monopolized by those who ruled, ensuring that memory always bent toward the interests of the empire. And yet, paradoxically, erasure itself left behind traces. A chiseled-out name on a stone inscription draws the eye. A mutilated relief invites questions. A conspicuous silence in the histories makes us wonder what was omitted. In this way, forgetting generated its own kind of memory, one of absence and mystery. We, centuries later, notice the gaps, the scars, the erasures, and in noticing them, we glimpse the anxieties Rome sought to conceal. Rome wanted us to forget, but in its very acts of forgetting, it revealed its deepest fears of rivals, of defeat, of mortality. What Rome tried to silence has become, ironically, one of the loudest testimonies of its history. Thus, the case studies of erased persons, families, and events are not isolated curiosities, but windows into the empire's soul. They reveal a society obsessed with control, a culture that understood power not only as the ability to command armies or pass laws, but as the ability to decide who would be remembered and who would vanish. In this light, erasure was not just a punishment or a strategy. It was the dark heartbeat of Rome's historical consciousness, pulsing beneath the surface of every inscription, every monument, and every silence. It was the hidden system that made Roman memory both brilliant and deeply sinister.
If the stories of condemned emperors, obliterated families, and forgotten defeats show us the targets of Rome's erasure, Then the next question is, how exactly was forgetting enforced? Erasure was not simply a decree shouted by senators or a wish whispered by emperors. It required mechanisms, tools, and a system that translated orders into visible action. Rome's mastery lay not only in identifying who or what should vanish, but also in orchestrating the disappearance, so thoroughly that absence itself became part of public life. To understand this machinery, we must explore the tangible methods through which Rome rewrote reality. The chisels that struck stone inscriptions, the hammers that toppled statues, the mints that reissued coinage, and the pens that reshaped history. These were not random acts of vandalism, but organized, often state-sanctioned efforts designed to make forgetting both enduring and authoritative. Stone inscriptions were perhaps the most visible victims of erasure. In a world where literacy was limited, inscriptions served as the billboards of Roman identity. They proclaimed the names of emperors, celebrated victories, and immortalized benefactors who funded public works. To erase a name from stone was to erase it from the very fabric of daily life. Citizens walking through the forum or visiting a temple would see the blank spaces where letters had once been carved. Sometimes entire lines were hacked out, leaving scars that still haunt the ruins today. In other cases, the chisel was more precise. A single name, excised with surgical care, leaving surrounding text intact. These mutilated inscriptions served as silent reminders of absence, enforcing the state's command to forget while simultaneously advertising its power to decide who deserved remembrance. Statues provided another canvas for forgetting. In the ancient world, statues were not mere art. They were embodiments of presence, physical stand-ins for emperors, generals, or deities. To look upon a statue was to encounter the authority of the person it represented. Erasing that presence often meant decapitating the statue or chiseling away the face, transforming a once revered figure into a disfigured husk. Heads were sometimes replaced with new likenesses, recycling the body for a different ruler. This practice was efficient and symbolic. Not only was the old ruler obliterated, but his very image was appropriated to honor the new. Public spaces, once filled with the likenesses of a condemned figure, could be quickly repopulated with statues that proclaimed continuity and strength. In this way, forgetting was not destruction alone, but also substitution, the replacement of one memory with another. Coins, too, played a crucial role in the mechanics of erasure. Because coins circulated widely, they carried the emperor's image into every marketplace and household. When a ruler was condemned, his coins were sometimes recalled, melted down, and reissued with new portraits. While practical limitations meant not every coin could be eliminated, the very act of reminting symbolized the rewriting of legitimacy. Over time, coins of condemned emperors became rarer, surviving mostly in private collections or buried hoards. The economic system itself became a tool of memory control, ensuring that the emperor's face disappeared from the hands of ordinary people. In a society where money was one of the few objects everyone touched daily, to change the coinage was to alter the texture of memory itself. Finally, there were the historians, the intellectual artisans of memory. Roman historians were not neutral chroniclers. They were often aligned with the ruling regime, dependent on imperial favor for their careers and safety. When emperors were condemned, historians minimized their reigns, caricatured them as tyrants, or omitted them entirely. The difference between remembering and forgetting lay in the stroke of a pen. Suetonius, Tacitus, and later writers gave us carefully curated accounts, steeped in bias shaped by the politics of their time. For every emperor or general we read about, how many others were deliberately obscured, their achievements hidden beneath layers of silence or invective. History itself became a mechanism of erasure, not merely recording the past, but deciding which parts of the past would survive. These mechanisms, inscriptions, statues, coins, and histories formed a coordinated system. Together, they ensured that Rome's orders of erasure were more than symbolic. They were material, visible, and unavoidable. They turned forgetting into something citizens could see and touch, something that shaped their daily interactions with the world around them. By striking a name from stone, replacing a head on a statue, reminting a coin, or rewriting a chronicle, Rome rewrote reality. And because these methods were so pervasive, the boundaries of memory itself came to feel natural, as if what was forgotten had never existed at all. Among the many tools Rome employed to enforce forgetting, These stand out because of their visibility in the daily lives of Romans. These were not hidden away in palaces or elite archives, but placed in the streets, temples, forums, and theaters where ordinary people gathered. Inscriptions and statues functioned as the public face of authority, the visible markers of who held power and whose memory was honored. Thus, when an emperor's name was chiseled out of stone or a statue was decapitated, it was not merely an act of destruction, but a public performance of forgetting. The Roman state was staging memory, turning erasure into a spectacle that citizens could not ignore. Forgetting was not a private affair, it was a collective ritual. Let's start with inscriptions, those countless announcements of building projects, dedications and honors carved onto stone. Romans encountered these everywhere. When an aqueduct was constructed or a temple was restored or gladiatorial games were funded, the benefactor's name went up in marble or bronze. These inscriptions served as a constant backdrop to civic life, a reminder of who was responsible for the comforts and spectacles that made Rome function and thrive. They also played a crucial role in the construction of the past. Inscriptions praised military victories and ensured that generals were immortalized in the very stones of the city, their deeds carved in stone for all eternity. Yet these inscriptions were also vulnerable. Chisel could undo permanence, scraping away letters and leaving behind jagged scars that spoke louder than the words once did. Imagine a Roman walking past an arch that had once borne the name of Domitian, only to see it brutally hacked away. The absence would be conspicuous, a reminder that memory itself was under imperial control. Statues amplified this effect. In a society where portraiture was highly realistic, statues were more than symbolic representations. They were almost extensions of the people they depicted. Citizens felt the presence of their leaders in these marble and bronze forms, scattered across forums, basilicas, and temples. To remove a head from a statue or to chisel away its facial features was to assault that presence. In some cases, the bodies of statues were preserved while the heads were swapped for new rulers, turning the figure of one emperor into that of his successor. This act was both practical and deeply ideological. It recycled the material but also made a statement that rulers could be replaced, identities rewritten, and memory remade. For those who saw these statues, the changes were unmistakable. A city once filled with Domitian-esque likeness might suddenly be filled with Trajan-esque, and the shift in memory would feel total. The psychological effect on ordinary Romans must have been profound. Unlike historians or senators, most citizens did not write books or issue decrees. They learned who their rulers were and what their rulers had done through what they saw around them. A marketplace with new inscriptions, a temple with altar dedications, a forum with unfamiliar faces, all of these changes reinforced the message of forgetting. Citizens were not asked whether they believed in the condemnation of a figure like Geta or Domitian. They were shown repeatedly through mutilated stones and statues that forgetting was not optional. Memory was curated for them, etched into the material world in ways they could not resist. Over time, as generations passed, the scars themselves might become accepted as normal, and the person erased might fade into genuine obscurity. But the paradox is that erasure was never seamless. A scraped name on a monument was still a scar, and scars invite curiosity. Ordinary Romans, seeing an empty space or a mutilated portrait, may have whispered among themselves about what had been removed. The very visibility of the act undermined its purpose. The condemned figure might be absent from official pronouncements, but in the shared memories of ordinary Romans, the erased person remained, a ghost haunting the city's stones. This unintended consequence is what makes inscriptions and statues such fascinating evidence for us today. They reveal both the success and the failure of Rome's attempt to control memory. Rome could command forgetting, but it could not control the whispers that absence inspired. In their daily lives, ordinary Romans were participants in the theater of erasure. They walked among mutilated monuments, gazed at recycled statues, and handled coins with ever-changing faces. They lived in a city where forgetting was written into stone, where the past could be reshaped overnight, and where the scars of that reshaping stared back at them with silent insistence. Inscriptions and statues were not passive victims of erasure. They were the stage upon which Rome's drama of memory was performed. For the citizens who witnessed it, forgetting was not abstract but tangible, etched into their very environment, shaping their understanding of who deserved honor and who was condemned to oblivion. Inscriptions and statues shaped the memory of Rome in public spaces, but coinage did so in the most intimate spaces: markets, homes, and the very hands of citizens. Coins were perhaps the most democratic medium of Roman imagery, circulating across the empire from Britain to Syria, from Egypt to Gaul. Every class of society, from senators to slaves, handled them daily, and on those small pieces of silver, bronze, and gold, the faces of emperors, the names of rulers, and the symbols of legitimacy. Coins were, in essence, miniature monuments, distributed by the millions, carrying propaganda into the furthest reaches of the empire. To alter coinage, therefore, was not simply an economic act, but a deeply political one. It allowed Rome to erase condemned figures from the most widespread medium of memory, transforming everyday transactions into rehearsals of loyalty to the ruling order. When an emperor was condemned, one of the first steps often involved halting the minting of his image. Coins bearing his likeness might be recalled, melted down, and reissued with a successor's face. Though Rome could not retrieve every coin already in circulation, the message was clear. The condemned ruler's legitimacy was no longer valid, his face no longer worthy of being carried in the hands of the people. The mint became an arm of historical revision, replacing one narrative with another. Just as a chisel could erase a name from stone, a die could strike a new face onto silver, overwriting memory with metal. This process had profound implications for how ordinary Romans engaged with power. In a society where literacy was limited, many citizens may never have read the decrees of the Senate or the histories of elite writers. But they knew their rulers through the faces on their coins. The emperor's portrait stared back at them during every purchase, every tax payment, every moment of exchange. Coins declared who ruled and who was to be remembered. To suddenly see a new face replacing the old would not have been a neutral change. It was a visible announcement of a shift in power, and, just as importantly, of a command to forget the figure who came before. Forgetting, in this sense, was not hidden in books or marble, but pressed directly into the fabric of daily life. The symbolism went even deeper. Coins often carried not only portraits but also slogans and imagery that reinforced imperial ideology. A condemned emperor's coins might proclaim eternal peace, victory, or divine favor messages that became embarrassing once his reign was denounced as tyrannical or illegitimate. To erase the emperor's image was to erase these claims as well, stripping away his legitimacy retroactively. By contrast, a new emperor could issue coins that declared his victories, his divine ancestry, or his role as restorer of liberty. The contrast between the erased and the newly minted became part of the imperial narrative. The condemned ruler was not simply forgotten. He was replaced by a rival whose legitimacy was made to seem stronger by comparison. There is also a fascinating paradox in how coins embody both erasure and survival. While many were melted down or withdrawn, others slipped through the cracks, hidden in hoards, buried with the dead, or simply overlooked in the vast economy of the empire. These surviving coins now serve as some of the most important evidence of Rome's condemned rulers. Figures whom the Senate tried to erase, such as Geta, Domitian, or even less-known claimants, they remain visible to us today because of these small, defiant artifacts. In trying to erase them, Rome inadvertently ensured that their memory would survive. Frozen in the metal that once carried their images into every corner of the empire. Thus, coins demonstrate both the power and the limits of erasure. They remind us that Rome's control over memory was formidable, but never absolute. For all its chisels, hammers, and dies, Rome could never fully erase the past. It could only bury it, hoping the silence would be enough. So far, we've seen how inscriptions, statues, and coins worked in the material world to reshape memory. But literature and historiography performed the same task in the realm of ideas. For words did not simply record events, they interpreted, framed, and transmitted them to future generations. A name struck from a stone might still be visible as a scar, but a name omitted from a history could vanish entirely, leaving no trace for later readers. Roman rulers understood this power, and historians, dependent on imperial favor for their positions, livelihoods, and even survival, often complied with the demands of erasure. The result was a literature that did not merely narrate history, but actively curated memory, amplifying what was useful, silencing what was dangerous, and reshaping the past to fit the ideological needs of the present. The bias of Roman historians is evident in almost every surviving account. Suetonius, for instance, compiled biographies of the Caesars that gleefully recounted scandalous details, but his selection of anecdotes often reflected political motives. Emperors condemned by the Senate, like Domitian, appear as cruel, paranoid tyrants, while others, like Augustus, are cast in more favorable light. Tacitus, though critical of imperial excess, still framed his narratives in ways that reinforced the legitimacy of the Senate, and cast condemned rulers in tones of corruption and tyranny. This selective storytelling was a form of intellectual damnatio memoria, ensuring that condemned figures survived in memory only as grotesque caricatures. By controlling how people were remembered, historians ensured that the verdict of erasure extended beyond stone and coin into the realm of collective imagination. Some rulers, especially short-lived usurpers or failed claimants to the throne, barely appear in the historical record. Their reigns, sometimes lasting only days or weeks, were treated as embarrassments, not worth recording in detail. In truth, these figures challenged Rome's stability and legitimacy in ways that were deeply threatening, which is precisely why they were silenced. To omit them was to deny them even the dubious immortality of condemnation. The absence of these rulers in major sources demonstrates how easily history could be rewritten, not by lies, but by silence. If no one spoke of them, they effectively ceased to exist in the minds of later generations. Poets and philosophers also played their role. Literature in Rome was often tied to patronage, and patrons were usually members of the ruling elite. This meant that even works not overtly historical often reinforced the politics of forgetting. A poet praising the current emperor might subtly erase or mock his predecessor, perpetuating the cultural narrative of condemnation. Philosophers, when reflecting on tyranny or virtue, frequently drew on stereotypes of condemned rulers as examples of vice, embedding the state's judgment into moral discourse itself. Thus, erasure seeped into every level of literature, from the annals of historians to the verses of poets and the treatises of philosophers. The long-term effect of this literary erasure was immense. Unlike statues or coins, which could be destroyed but not entirely controlled, texts had the potential to define the very framework of history. Later generations relied heavily on the accounts of Roman historians, meaning the biases and silences of those authors were reproduced for centuries. If Tacitus or Suetonius condemned an emperor, that condemnation echoed through the Middle Ages and beyond, shaping how modern scholarship and popular imagination view these figures. Even today, our perception of emperors like Domitian, Caligula, or Nero is colored not just by archaeology, but by the literary legacy of their enemies. The Roman state's manipulation of historians ensured that erasure extended across time, shaping not only how Romans remembered their past, but how we remember it today. In this way, literature became the most enduring weapon of erasure. Stones can crumble, statues can be shattered, and coins can be lost. But words once written and copy can persist across millennia by embedding erasure into the written record. Rome ensured that forgetting was not only a political act of the present, but also a cultural inheritance for the future. The condemned did not merely vanish from the streets of Rome, they were banished from the story of Rome itself. And in that silence, we hear the empire's most chilling achievement, the ability to make memory itself a tool of domination. Inscriptions and literature certainly shaped memory in the ancient world, but in Rome, the power of forgetting was performed in the flesh. Rome understood the power of words and symbols, but it also knew that forgetting could be enacted in the space. Between words and symbols and the things that were left unsaid, the images unshown, the statues toppled, the names left unspoken. Rome was a city defined by its rituals. Ceremonies, spectacles, and state rituals were the heartbeat of Roman political life. They were attended by thousands, not only senators and patricians, but common folk as well. And they were infused with symbolic meaning that could be manipulated by those in power to shape how Romans understood their past and present. This is why the core of Rome's memory practices can be understood as performative forgetting. Forgetting was as much an action as remembering. Within these shared moments, the empire could rewrite memory not only on marble or parchment, but on the living bodies of its citizens. Festivals, sacrifices, triumphs, funerals, all carried political messages. And when an individual was condemned to erasure, These rituals either excluded them or publicly destroyed their memory. Funerals are a good example. The death of an emperor was one of the most dramatic occasions for collective ritual. When a ruler was beloved or at least tolerated, the Senate might vote to consecrate them as a divus, a divine figure to be worshipped. Statues were erected, temples were built, and their names were invoked in oaths and prayers. But when a ruler was hated, feared, or politically inconvenient, the opposite occurred. The Senate declared them hostis, an enemy of the state, and decreed their memory damned. In practice, this meant that their images were removed from ceremonial spaces, their names omitted from public recitations, and their place in civic rituals deliberately erased. Thus, ceremonies that had once honored them were transformed into instruments of forgetting, publicly confirming that the condemned no longer held a place in the sacred life of Rome. Triumphs, those grand military parades celebrating victory, also functioned as moments of memory control. In these spectacles, the Senate and the emperor decided which enemies to highlight and which to obscure. Victorious generals paraded captured leaders, treasures, and symbols through the streets, ensuring that some foes were immortalized in infamy. Yet for others, the opposite was chosen. Their names were suppressed, their likenesses excluded, and their existence left unacknowledged. Imagine, for instance, a Roman general defeating a Gallic tribe. After the battle, he might lead a triumph with the captured Gallic chieftain paraded before him. But if that chieftain died, resisting Rome, his memory would be spared. Rome wouldn't bother erasing someone who didn't even fight for Rome. On the other hand, if the chieftain had surrendered only to betray Rome later, his memory would become a tool of Rome's political control. His image would be shown in the triumph to remind the crowds of his disloyalty. And after the celebration, his statue would be erected in prominent locations throughout the city, not as a symbol of defeat, but of disloyalty, reminding all who saw it what happens to those who betray Rome. Religious ceremonies also played their part. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with politics, and erasure extended into the sacred sphere. When a person fell under damnatio memoria, their statues were sometimes melted down and refashioned into new cult images. Their dedications in temples chipped away, and their names excluded from prayers. Festivals tied to their reign or their person were cancelled, leaving no annual moment in which the people might recall them. The gods themselves were invoked as participants in this forgetting, as if divine will aligned with senatorial decree. By rooting erasure in religion, Rome gave it not only civic but cosmic legitimacy. Forgetting was not just political expedience, it was sanctified as divine justice. Finally, public executions offered another powerful form of performative erasure. When traitors or usurpers were captured alive, their deaths were often staged to obliterate their dignity and ensure that memory preserved only their shame. The condemned might be strangled in the Tullianum, Rome's most infamous prison, their corpses denied burial, their names cursed by public proclamation. By stripping them of the final honors of death, Rome sought to deny them the basic right of remembrance. In a society where the funeral was one of the most important rituals of memory, complete with processions, speeches, and ancestral masks, this denial was a devastating form of forgetting. It made the absence of memory painfully visible, a void that itself spoke volumes about their disgrace. These rituals remind us that erasure was not a silent process conducted in the back rooms of the Senate. It was loud, public, and often theatrical, a performance designed to impress upon the people that forgetting was both necessary and inevitable. The crowd became participants in the act, watching statues destroyed, hearing names omitted, witnessing bodies disgraced. Forgetting was not left to the passive workings of time. It was actively staged, reinforced, and sanctified. Through ritual, Rome transformed erasure from a mere political tool into a cultural rhythm, one that pulsed through the empire's festivals, parades, and ceremonies. The condemned were not simply absent. They were made absent before the eyes of all, their erasure itself remembered, even if their names and deeds were not. When we step back and consider the many tools Rome employed to erase its enemies, what emerges is not a scattered set of ad hoc practices, but a comprehensive system of control, a machinery of forgetting that spanned every dimension of public and private life. It began with the most visible symbols: statues toppled, inscriptions chiseled, coins defaced, but it did not end there. These acts were only the outer layer, the tangible signals that someone had been condemned. Beneath them lay deeper layers of erasure: the silences of historians, the omissions in the annals, the restructuring of rituals and festivals, the denial of funerary rites, the whispered curses that transformed names into warnings rather than memories. Each mechanism reinforced the others, weaving together a network of absence so tight that few condemned figures could ever escape it. Forgetting was not left to chance. It was engineered, cultivated, and rehearsed until it became second nature to Roman society. The brilliance and the cruelty of this system was its redundancy. If one form of erasure failed, others compensated. A broken statue might still preserve a recognizable face. But if the texts all portrayed that face as monstrous, its survival carried little weight. A coin bearing the condemned's profile might circulate for decades, but if rituals never spoke their name, if children never learned their deeds, the image would lose meaning. Even when gaps or scars remained as in the erasures on inscriptions, they acted as reminders not of the condemned, but of the state's authority to decide whose memory deserves survival. The system did not seek to eliminate every trace, for traces could serve as warnings. Rather, it sought to strip traces of their power, leaving only fragments framed by the empire's narrative of disgrace. This comprehensive approach also ensured that erasure transcended social classes. The elite might engage with history through books and Senate debates, where omissions and hostile portrayals did their work. The ordinary citizen, who perhaps never read a historian, experienced erasure in public rituals, in the absence of statues, in the whispered tone of neighbors when certain names arose. Even the illiterate could sense who had been condemned simply by the absence of their portrait in the forum or the disappearance of their name from dedications. Erasure was thus democratized, made accessible to all levels of Roman society. Every citizen participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in the maintenance of collective forgetting. The psychological impact of this system was profound. To live under an empire that could erase not only your life, but your memory was to exist under the constant surveillance of reputation. Ambition became entangled with fear: rise to high, offend the wrong patron, or fail in the wrong way. And the punishment extended beyond death. It reached into the afterlife of remembrance, severing ties with descendants, erasing achievements, denying immortality in history. Roman culture, which placed such high value on honor, legacy, and the continuation of the family name, turned memory itself into a battleground. All still in their own time, these figures were effectively erased, and that was what mattered to Rome. The combination of stone, coin, word, and ritual created a latticework of forgetting so pervasive that contemporaries had little chance of resisting it. Memory was not a natural process, but a carefully staged performance, choreographed by the Senate, enforced by emperors, and echoed by writers, priests, and the people themselves. Through this system, Rome revealed its darkest secret. The empire did not merely conquer territory and govern bodies, it conquered memory itself. And in mastering the politics of forgetting, it claimed dominion over something even more enduring than land or power: the human story. If the first three segments showed us how Rome erased its enemies through destruction, silence, and ritualized forgetting, the next layer of its dark strategy was not simple erasure but transformation. For while some names were stricken from the record entirely, others were deliberately preserved, but only as villains. Rome understood that history was not merely a catalog of facts, but a stage for morality plays. Stories designed to warn, instruct, and legitimize. And so, rather than allowing every condemned figure to fade into obscurity, the empire at times chose to reshape them into enduring symbols of corruption, arrogance, or treachery. This practice gave the empire a double benefit. It eliminated the honor of remembrance, while weaponizing the dishonor of infamy. In other words, Rome did not just forget it manufactured villains. One of the clearest examples of this comes from the way emperors like Caligula and Nero were remembered. These men, certainly flawed and extravagant rulers by any measure, became in the hands of Roman historians grotesque caricatures of tyranny. Every indulgence was exaggerated, every cruelty embellished, every rumor recorded as if it were fact. Nero, who in reality had moments of popularity and artistic patronage, was transformed into a near-cartoonish embodiment of excess. The fiddler who played while Rome burned, the despot who murdered his own family for pleasure, the mad emperor whose narcissism knew no bounds. Whether or not all these stories were true mattered less than the effect they achieved. By enshrining Nero as the archetype of vice, Rome created a convenient scapegoat, a single figure upon whom the empire's anxieties and failures could be projected, and through whom later rulers could define themselves by contrast. The construction of villains was not limited to emperors. Senators, generals, and usurpers also found themselves cast in roles carefully tailored by the state's narrative needs. Take Sejanus, the powerful Praetorian prefect under Tiberius. At the height of his influence, he controlled access to the emperor and wielded enormous power in Rome. Yet when Tiberius turned against him, Sejanus's image was shattered overnight. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions erased, and his name cursed in the Senate. But the erasure did not stop there. The stories that survived about Sejanus paint him as a scheming traitor, a man consumed by ambition and corruption. Whatever nuance existed in his real life, his talents, his alliances, his service was obliterated, leaving only the cartoon of a villain who deserved his downfall. By constructing Sejanus as an embodiment of betrayal, Rome sent a message to every ambitious courtier: rise to high, and you too will be destroyed, remembered only as a warning. The manipulation of villainy also served to preserve the image of the state itself. By concentrating corruption in the figure of a single man, Rome could deflect responsibility from the broader system. If Nero was evil, then the empire itself remained sound, merely the victim of one wicked ruler. If Sejanus betrayed Tiberius, then the emperor's lapses of judgment were excusable, for he too was deceived. Villains became lightning rods, absorbing public anger and preserving the legitimacy of Rome's institutions. In this way, history was less a neutral account than a carefully managed theater of blame. Erasure erased honor, but villainization erased nuance. Turning complex human beings into one-dimensional props in Rome's ongoing performance of power, this process reveals another paradox of Roman memory. The condemned could become immortal precisely because of their condemnation. Names erased from stones might vanish, but names preserved as villains endured for centuries. The memory of Nero, Caligula, or Sejanus survives far more vividly than many competent, unremarkable rulers or senators whose lives left little controversy. By condemning them, Rome ensured that their infamy outlived their contemporaries, shaping cultural memory long after their bones turned to dust. Infamy, then, was another form of control. A life denied honor, stripped of nuance, but kept alive as a tool of instruction. It was remembrance turned inside out, survival twisted into punishment. In this light, we see that Rome's mastery of memory was not limited to silence and absence. Just as powerful was its ability to create presence, an overwhelming grotesque presence of villainy. By choosing which enemies to erase and which to immortalize as villains, Rome choreographed the moral landscape of its history. It left behind not a balanced account of human complexity, but a pantheon of exaggerated villains, which carefully shaped to reflect the empire's needs. These figures were not allowed to rest in the neutral ground of memory. They were preserved as eternal scapegoats, forever condemned to serve Rome even in death. But to understand how Rome constructed these manufactured villains, we must look at the mechanics of exaggeration. The subtle and not-so-subtle ways rumor became fact, and fact became myth. Roman society was a fertile ground for gossip, and its historians often thrived on anecdote and scandal. Yet when the state had an interest in condemning a figure, these anecdotes were not merely reported, they were cultivated, amplified, and repeated until they hardened into historical truth. What began as whispers in the marketplace could, within a generation, become the central defining feature of a person's legacy. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate process of character assassination, one that blurred the line between history and propaganda. Take the case of Caligula. His reign was undeniably marked by erratic decisions and extravagance. But the image we inherit of a madman appointing his horse to high office, of a ruler delighting in grotesque cruelty, bears the fingerprints of hostile exaggeration. Ancient sources such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio relished these tales, weaving them into narratives of unrestrained lunacy. But even ancient readers questioned the plausibility of such stories. Did Caligula truly intend to make his horse consul, or was it a sarcastic joke mocking the Senate's incompetence? The distinction was lost as the rumor was retold. By the time the story reached posterity, nuance had evaporated, and what remained was a neat symbol of imperial madness, perfectly suited to the role of villain. Thus, a ruler who may have been eccentric and provocative was immortalized as a figure of absurd despotism. Nero, too, illustrates this mechanism of villain-making. Stories of his artistic ambitions, his performances on stage, and his indulgent lifestyle became fodder for moral condemnation. The infamous tale of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is one of history's most enduring images, yet it collapses under scrutiny. The violin did not even exist in Nero's time, and contemporary accounts suggest he was not in Rome when the fire began. Nevertheless, the story endured because it distilled a powerful moral. Nero was not merely incompetent but monstrous, so obsessed with vanity that he delighted in the destruction of his people. Whether true or not was irrelevant. The story encapsulated the image Rome wanted to project. By exaggerating Nero's flaws and embedding them in vivid anecdotes, historians turned rumor into truth, truth into legend, and legend into the scaffolding of villainy. Even lesser-known figures were not immune to this process. Usurpers who briefly seized power often became embodiments of arrogance or greed, with their fleeting reigns portrayed as cautionary tales. Their personal habits, if known at all, were magnified into symbols of corruption. Preference for luxury became gluttony. A single act of cruelty became habitual savagery. An error in judgment became evidence of madness. By distorting personal traits into archetypal vices, Rome ensured that the condemned were not remembered as people, but as allegories. They were stripped of individuality and transformed into symbols, warnings carved into the collective imagination. The power of this exaggeration lay in its simplicity. Complex political realities, senatorial rivalries, military mutinies were difficult to explain and harder to control. But personal vices could be dramatized, personified, and retold in the form of entertaining stories. A tyrant who danced on stage, a madman who worshipped his horse, or a despot who murdered his family, these were narratives that stuck in the public mind far more easily than discussions of tax reforms or provincial unrest. By anchoring political problems to the failings of individuals, Rome not only condemned its enemies, but distracted attention from deeper systemic flaws. Villains became scapegoats, not just for their own sins, but for the empire's failings. This reliance on exaggeration and rumor reveals the intimate connection between entertainment and power in Roman memory. The same stories that condemned emperors also fascinated audiences, ensuring their circulation. Scandal, after all, was a form of spectacle. In the forums and bathhouses, in taverns and marketplaces, tales of Nero's debauchery or Caligula's madness became popular conversation, repeated and embellished until they became common knowledge. The people themselves became unwitting participants in the state's narrative, perpetuating the very myths that secured Rome's control over memory. Villainy was not only imposed from above, it was embraced from below, a cultural performance as much as a political one. In the end, the villains Rome created were not just political casualties, but cultural constructions, shaped by rumor, amplified by historians, and cemented by repetition. They reveal a profound truth about memory in Rome, that it was not neutral, but curated, not descriptive, but prescriptive. To be condemned was not only to be forgotten, but to be remembered in the worst possible way. Your life distorted into a parable of vice. And once these parables took hold, they endured with a force that outlasted empires, echoing through history as cautionary tales that still color our perceptions today. If exaggeration and rumor gave Rome the material for constructing villains, the real power of these narratives lay in how they were deployed as moral lessons. Roman society was steeped in didactic traditions. History was not merely a record of events, but a repository of examples, exemplate to be imitated or avoided. From childhood, Romans were taught that the past offered guidance for the present, that the deeds of ancestors and rulers contained lessons on virtue, discipline, and loyalty. Within this framework, manufactured villains became more than condemned figures. They became moral warnings, parables dressed in historical clothing. The condemned were cast as living embodiments of vice, their lives stripped of nuance and repackaged as cautionary tales meant to instruct citizens and emperors alike. Consider the fate of Nero's legacy. The stories surrounding him were not preserved simply as colorful anecdotes, but as moral examples of unchecked indulgence, cruelty, and vanity. When later emperors sought to define their own reigns, they often did so in direct contrast to Nero's supposed excesses. A new emperor who refused luxury, who presented himself as disciplined and austere, was implicitly making a claim. I am not Nero. In this way, Nero's villainy became a tool of political legitimacy, a negative example against which rulers could demonstrate their virtue. The more grotesque the stories of Nero became, the more virtuous his successors appeared by comparison. Thus the villain served not only to erase his own honor, but to reinforce the honor of those who followed. Caligula played a similar role. His supposed madness and cruelty became a touchstone for discussions about tyranny and the dangers of absolute power. Roman authors, senators, and later political philosophers used him as an archetype of what happens when unchecked authority corrupts absolutely. By painting Caligula as a deranged despot, Rome supplied future generations with a concrete example of tyranny, a warning encoded in history. His life became less about the man himself and more about the lesson his story taught. Through him, the empire instructed its citizens and rulers alike. Allow power to corrupt you, and you will be remembered as a monster damned for eternity. Even figures like Sejanus, whose careers were cut short before they could rise to imperial heights, were preserved in memory as archetypes of treachery. His betrayal of Tiberius became a staple in discussions of loyalty, ambition, and the dangers of overreaching. To every senator, his story whispered a warning. Do not grow too bold. Do not overstep the delicate balance of favor and ambition, or you too will be condemned. His villainy was not remembered for its own sake, but as a lesson on the perils of political overreach. This pedagogical use of villains extended beyond politics into the moral sphere of ordinary life. Romans reading or hearing tales of wicked rulers were not only entertained, but reminded of the consequences of vice. Stories of gluttony, debauchery, cruelty, and madness carried moral weight, reinforcing cultural norms about moderation, discipline, and piety. The condemned became anti-heroes in Rome's collective morality play, their failures reinforcing the virtues that Roman society claimed to prize. Villainy was thus instrumentalized as pedagogy. The more grotesque the portrait, the sharper the lesson. This pedagogical function of these villains reveals the degree to which memory in Rome was less about accuracy than about utility. The condemned did not need to be portrayed fairly, needed to serve as useful exemplar. Their lives were rewritten to fit the moral and political needs of the empire. Truth was secondary to function. By turning villains into moral lessons, Rome not only controlled the narrative of the past, but also shaped the behavior of the present. Fear of being remembered like Nero, Caligula, or Sejanus disciplined rulers and citizens alike, keeping ambition, indulgence, and disloyalty in check. Ultimately, the transformation of enemies into moral lessons demonstrates how deeply Rome understood the power of narrative. Erasure erased honor, but villainization preserved dishonor in a way that benefited the state. It was not enough for the condemned to be forgotten. Their stories had to be repurposed, their lives twisted into warnings that reinforced Rome's ideals. In this sense, Rome achieved a chilling mastery over memory, the ability not only to silence voices, but to make them speak forever in service of the empire's lessons. The condemned could not escape even in death. They were remembered, but only as villains, their identities reduced to cautionary symbols in Rome's moral theater. If villainous legacies served as moral lessons for the broader populace, they were equally powerful weapons in the hands of the Senate and subsequent emperors. Condemnation was not only about shaming the dead, it was about controlling the living, a reminder to both rulers and subjects that the machinery of memory lay in the hands of those who governed. By shaping the image of condemned figures, the Senate and emperors reinforced their own authority, ensuring that the story of Rome always bent toward the legitimacy of its institutions. Villains were created not merely to embody vice, but to serve as political tools, their reputations destroyed in order to consolidate power in the present. One of the clearest demonstrations of this is seen in how the Senate wielded damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. When a ruler or official was condemned, the process was not only punitive but performative. Senators would rise and deliver speeches cataloging the vices of the condemned, rehearsing the litany of crimes that justified their erasure. These speeches were more than accusations. They were declarations of senatorial authority, a reminder that even emperors could be judged by Rome's governing body. By damning an emperor's memory, the Senate affirmed its own role as guardian of Roman values, presenting itself as the arbiter of legitimacy. The condemned, no matter how powerful in life, became pawns in the Senate's performance of authority. Their villainous legacies were tools to project senatorial power into the collective consciousness. Later emperors also found great use in the construction of villainous predecessors. To inherit the throne after a tyrant was to inherit an opportunity, the chance to contrast oneself with the condemned, and appear as the savior of Rome. When Domitian was assassinated, for example, the Senate rushed to condemn him, and his successor, Nerva, presented himself as the opposite of Domitian's cruelty, a ruler of moderation, clemency, and harmony with the Senate. Domitian's villainy was not only useful in erasing his honor, but in elevating Nerva's legitimacy. This dynamic repeated itself throughout Rome's history. The sins of the condemned became the virtues of their successors. A new emperor could step onto the stage not as a mere ruler, but as the redeemer of Rome, bathed in the moral light cast by the shadow of his villainous predecessor. This process also served to unify the public. By condemning a villain, Rome offered its citizens a shared narrative, collective enemy against whom they could direct their frustrations. In times of crisis, plagues, economic hardship, or political instability, the construction of a villain provided a scapegoat. Citizens could blame the condemned for the empire's woes, absolving the present system of deeper guilt. This scapegoating mechanism not only stabilized the empire, but also deflected attention away from structural problems. Instead of questioning whether Rome's institutions were themselves corrupt or failing, people were encouraged to believe that one wicked ruler, one treacherous senator, or one ambitious general was to blame. The villain absorbed the anger of the masses, protecting the legitimacy of Rome's larger political order. It is also telling that many of Rome's most infamous villains emerged during transitional periods moments when legitimacy was in question. Succession was unstable, or the Senate sought to reassert itself. The very act of constructing villains was often a sign of fragility within the system. By creating a moral enemy, the empire masked its uncertainty, using villainy as a form of political glue. The more grotesque the villain, the more necessary the current ruler appeared, the more justified the Senate's authority seemed. Villain-making was not just about history, it was about the immediate demands of politics, a way to consolidate control in times of vulnerability. Thus, the construction of villains functioned as a dual strategy. It punished the condemned while empowering the living. The Senate preserved its role as judge. Emperors reinforced their legitimacy through contrast, and the public found an outlet for frustration in the scapegoat provided to them. Villains were created, not discovered. They were tailored to Rome's needs, their stories sculpted to fit the political moment. And in this process, the condemned lost not only their honor but their identity, remade into instruments of power long after their deaths. Their voices silenced, their lives distorted. They were remembered not as they were, but as Rome required them to be. The endurance of these villainous portrayals did not end with the immediate political moment. Once a person had been cast into the role of a monster, their legacy became woven into Roman culture, philosophy, and even the literary imagination that future generations inherited. The works of historians, poets, and moralists ensured that these constructed images outlived their creators, shaping not only the way contemporaries understood the past, but also the way later civilizations interpreted Rome itself. In this sense, Rome's propaganda became immortal, echoing across centuries, embedding itself in the Western canon as if it were truth rather than performance. The condemned were thus doubly erased, first from honor in their own time, and then from fairness in posterity, remembered not as complex human beings, but as archetypes of vice. Roman historians were particularly instrumental in this transmission of villainy. Writers such as Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio filled their narratives with cautionary tales of emperors gone mad, senators consumed by ambition, or generals undone by pride. Although these authors often offered subtle criticisms of the Senate and imperial court, they also perpetuated the images Rome had constructed. Their depictions of figures like Domitian, Nero, or Commodus as cruel, decadent, and tyrannical were shaped not only by their own opinions, but also by the cultural atmosphere of condemnation in which they wrote. Once recorded by respected historians, these narratives gained a veneer of legitimacy. What began as political performance became historical truth, canonized in the scrolls that students, politicians, and philosophers would study for centuries to come. The reach of these portrayals extended into moral philosophy as well. Stoic thinkers and other moralists often cited condemned emperors or disgraced senators as warnings against the corruption of power and the dangers of vice. Nero's alleged indulgences in music, theater, and cruelty were invoked as examples of how unchecked desires led to ruin, while the downfall of Sejanus was presented as evidence of ambition's destructive path. These examples served not only as historical lessons, but as moral instruction. In this way, villainous legacies became didactic tools, stripped of their nuance and individuality to serve the broader goal of teaching virtue through the specter of vice. The condemned became symbols rather than people. Their humanity dissolved into abstractions that reinforced Rome's philosophical traditions. Cultural portrayals extended further still. Playwrights and poets found inspiration in the downfall of infamous figures, turning them into characters in dramas that audiences consumed with fascination. The theater, already a medium rich in allegory and moral tension, absorbed the stories of Rome's villains, giving them a performative afterlife on the stage. Citizens who watched these plays were reminded of the supposed dangers of tyranny, greed, or betrayal, their emotional responses shaped by the narratives Rome had already constructed. The condemned were thus trapped in a cycle of representation, first condemned by politicians, then vilified by historians, and finally dramatized for the entertainment and instruction of the masses. Each layer reinforced the next, leaving little room for the possibility that these figures might have been more complex than their villainous portraits suggested. Even beyond Rome, these portrayals traveled into later Western thought. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Roman histories and absorbed their depictions of emperors and officials, often repeating them uncritically. Early modern political theorists pointed to the tyrannies of figures like Caligula or Domitian as warnings against unchecked monarchy, embedding Rome's propaganda into the very foundations of European political philosophy. Shakespeare himself would echo Roman villain-making in his depictions of figures like Julius Caesar or Coriolanus, dramatizing Rome's narratives for Elizabethan audiences. In this way, the condemned of Rome continued to serve as foils. Their distorted images carried into new contexts, shaping debates about governance, morality, and power long after the empire itself had fallen. This continuity demonstrates the extraordinary power of Rome's propaganda machine. By crafting villains in the service of immediate political needs, Rome also shaped the memory of Western civilization, ensuring that certain figures would never escape the shadows cast upon them. Their reputations were not merely destroyed for the present, they were sentenced to an eternity of misrepresentation. And because the machinery of memory was backed by Rome's prestige, its cultural dominance, and its enduring influence, these villainous portrayals became as durable as marble monuments, etched not into stone, but into the imagination of humanity itself. In the end, the creation of villains within Roman political culture was not simply about punishing enemies or erasing rivals. It was about controlling the very lens through which Romans and later generations would view history. By manufacturing figures of vice, Rome turned individuals into mirrors that reflected the values and insecurities of the state itself. The condemned became cautionary tales, warnings against disloyalty, ambition, excess, or treachery. Not because their lives necessarily embodied these traits, but because Rome required them to. The stories told about them were not windows into truth, but carefully constructed allegories. Instruments of power designed to affirm the legitimacy of the Senate, the emperor, and the political order as a whole. This was the genius and the darkness of Rome's manipulation of memory. It did not simply silence enemies, but reanimated them in distorted forms, ensuring their afterlives served the empire's purposes. The echoes of this can be seen throughout the ancient world. When Augustus required Tiberius to divorce his wife Julia, to prevent accusations of adultery from damaging his own reputation, he simultaneously created a martyr and a warning. Julia's subsequent banishment and mysterious death became a potent symbol of the emperor's absolute authority and the perils of defying him. Her story, though likely embellished, served as a reminder for any potential rival of the cost of ambition. Rome's strategy was not limited to silencing women. Its treatment of Catiline, Cicero's political opponent, exemplified the same tactics. Accused of plotting to overthrow the Republic, Catiline's supposed conspiracy, whether real or concocted by Cicero, provided a convenient foil for the statesman's own designs. Catiline was vilified in speeches that celebrated Cicero's patriotism, thereby enhancing his political career. After Catiline's failed attempt to seize Rome and his subsequent suicide, Cicero ensured his infamy by writing a detailed account of the conspiracy that cast Catiline as an evil genius, a mastermind, whose nefarious plans were thwarted only by Cicero's intervention. This construction of Catiline not only silenced an opponent, but created a boogeyman to instill fear among potential rivals for generations to come.
Wow.
Even those who fell victim to the vagaries of fortune were not spared. The tragic tale of the Gracchi brothers, whose attempts at land reform led to their violent deaths, was manipulated by Rome to serve its own ends. Despite their genuine popularity with the common people and the injustice of their fate, the Gracchi were condemned as dangerous radicals, a warning of the chaos that would ensue if the social order was disrupted. Their memory became a tool for the ruling elite to rally the populace against supposed threats to stability and tradition, thus solidifying their own position. The most chilling aspect of this process was its effect on the Julio-Claudian dynasty. As the first imperial dynasty, they faced constant challenges to their authority to secure their rule. They constructed a narrative of virtue and divine favor that emphasized their own piety and the depravity of their enemies. Caligula, Augustus's great-nephew, was condemned as a monster. Despite some of the charges against him being politically motivated or outright fabricated, his infamous debauchery and alleged atrocities became a stick with which to beat future emperors. Most notably Nero, who was accused of similar excesses to discredit his reign. In doing so, Rome sacrificed the truth at the altar of political expediency, creating villains to bolster its own legitimacy. What is most striking is how effective this strategy proved to be. Centuries later, we still remember names like Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Sejanus with a shudder. Not as human beings, but as caricatures of cruelty, madness, and ambition. The fact that their reputations endure in this way testifies to the success of Rome's project. By embedding these villainous legacies into historical writing, philosophical discourse, and cultural performance, Rome ensured that its propaganda would outlive its empire. Even today, when scholars attempt to rehabilitate these figures, to sift fact from fiction, they must contend with the weight of centuries of distortion. The villains of Rome remain villains because their stories have become too deeply ingrained to be fully undone. This endurance should remind us of the fragility of historical truth. If the greatest empire of the ancient world could so thoroughly reshape memory to suit its needs, what does that say about the histories we inherit, the narratives we take for granted, the reputations we accept as fact? Rome's villains teach us not only about Rome itself, but about the power of storytelling in all political systems. Every society constructs its villains. Every culture uses memory to reinforce its values, and every generation must question the stories it has been told. The danger lies not only in the erasure of the condemned, but in the certainty with which their distorted images are accepted as truth. Thus, the political scapegoats of Rome stand as both victims and instruments. Victims, because their true selves were lost beneath layers of propaganda. Instruments, because their villainous portrayals strengthened the hand of those who condemned them. In this paradox lies the brilliance of Rome's monist manipulation of memory. It turned erasure into creation, transforming silence into speech, ensuring that even in death, the condemned could serve the empire's purposes. By mastering the art of villain-making, Rome demonstrated a chilling lesson that history is never merely a record of the past, but always a battlefield where power, memory, and identity are contested.
Ow!
And on that battlefield, the victors are not only those who survive, but those who decide what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. If the construction of villains allowed Rome to manage its political anxieties, the manipulation of military memory allowed it to preserve its aura of invincibility. Rome, after all, was an empire built on conquest, and its legitimacy rested heavily on the perception of martial superiority. Victories were paraded in triumphs, immortalized in monuments, inscribed on coins, and sung in poetry. Defeats, by contrast, posed an existential threat not only to Rome's armies, but to the very mythology of Roman supremacy. To acknowledge failure was to admit vulnerability. Vulnerability was something the empire could scarcely afford to project. Thus, Rome developed a parallel practice to damnatio memoria, the suppression, distortion, or outright erasure of its humiliations on the battlefield. When Rome faltered, the empire. This memory machine ensured that the defeat would either be reframed into a narrative of resilience or buried so deeply in silence that future generations could scarcely grasp its significance. One of the most glaring examples of this strategy was the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat at Cannae in 216 BCE. During the Second Punic War, Hannibal annihilated a Roman army of nearly 80,000 men, inflicting one of the worst military disasters in recorded history. The sheer scale of the loss was staggering. Tens of thousands of Romans lay dead on the battlefield. The Senate trembled, and much of Italy seemed ready to defect to Hannibal's cause. Yet what survives in the Roman memory of Cannae is not primarily the defeat itself, but the story of Rome's perseverance. Livy, in his monumental history, frames Cannae less as a humiliation and more as a test of Roman resilience. Emphasizing the Senate's refusal to negotiate, the citizenry's stoic endurance, and the eventual resurgence of Roman arms under Scipio Africanus, the devastation of Cannae becomes, in Livy's telling, a prelude to ultimate triumph, a disaster transformed into moral theater. The staggering defeat is not erased outright, but its sting is dulled by the narrative alchemy that turns shame into virtue. Rome was not always so generous in remembering its defeats. At Carrhae, in 53 BCE, the ambitious triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus led an army into Parthian territory, seeking glory and balance against the reputations of Caesar and Pompey. Instead, he blundered into disaster, losing tens of thousands of men to the Parthian cavalry. Crassus himself was killed, his head allegedly used as a prop in a Parthian theatrical performance. For Rome, Carrhae was a humiliation beyond bearing, a reminder that the empire's eastern frontier was not invulnerable, and that even its wealthiest leaders could stumble into catastrophe. Roman sources treat the battle with a mixture of brevity and moralism, reducing Crassus' death to a cautionary tale about greed and ambition rather than a frank reckoning with the scale of the defeat. The disaster was not commemorated with public monuments, nor was it paraded in civic memory. Instead, it lingered in the margins, a story told in whispers and moral lessons rather than triumphal narratives. Perhaps the most dramatic example of erasure came with the Varian disaster of 09 CE, when 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss of some 20,000 men sent shockwaves through the empire. And Emperor Augustus is said to have wandered his palace crying, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Yet despite its scale, the disaster quickly receded into the shadows of Roman memory. Unlike victories, which were emblazoned on monuments and coins, the Varian defeat left no public commemorations. Officially, the legion numbers 17, 18, and the 19th were never used again, as though the units themselves had been erased from existence. The silence was deliberate, an attempt to bury the shame and prevent the memory of defeat from undermining Rome's aura of inevitability. Later Roman writers mention the disaster, but always framed as an isolated tragedy, a temporary setback, rather than as evidence of systemic vulnerability. The official memory machine sought not to deny that the disaster occurred, but to ensure it never became central to Rome's story. In each of these cases, Carrhae, Cannae, and Teutoburg, the strategy was consistent. Defeats were reframed as moral lessons, minimized through silence or overshadowed by later triumphs. The goal was never to preserve a balanced historical record, but to curate memory in such a way that Rome's prestige remained untarnished. Victories were eternal, defeats were fleeting. Triumphs were immortalized, humiliations were forgotten. This selective memory was not accidental but structural, woven into the very fabric of Roman culture. For an empire that thrived on the image of destiny and divine favor, the control of memory was as vital as the control of armies.
Rome's genius lay not only in suppressing defeats, but in reshaping them into narratives that reinforced its central values. When defeat could not be fully hidden, it was reframed as an episode of resilience, a temporary setback that ultimately magnified the glory of Rome's eventual triumphs. This was a form of narrative alchemy, transforming humiliation into moral theatre. The loss at Cannae, for instance, was devastating in its immediate consequences, but later generations were taught to view it as the crucible from which Roman endurance emerged. Livy and other historians emphasized how the Senate, rather than collapsing under despair, refused to consider negotiation with Hannibal. They highlighted stories of aristocrats who volunteered their sons for military service, even after losing others in the battle, or of matrons who offered their wealth for the war effort without hesitation. In this telling, the blood-soaked fields of Apulia became less about Roman failure and more about Roman courage. Loyalty and determination to outlast adversity. Defeat, in other words, was rewritten as a stage on which Roman virtue could shine brighter. This reframing also aligned with Rome's obsession with virtues, the ideal of masculine courage and steadfastness. Defeats became moral lessons, showing that true Roman character was measured not by the absence of setbacks, but by the ability to endure and overcome them. Cannae was not remembered as the moment Hannibal shattered Rome's power, but as the moment Rome discovered its unbreakable will. Later, military training and civic education invoked this memory, using it as a warning against despair and as an affirmation of Roman destiny. By elevating resilience above victory, Rome managed to turn one of its darkest moments into a cornerstone of its self-image. The defeat was remembered. Yes, but not as Hannibal's triumph, rather as Rome's test, and eventually as the prelude to Rome's eventual conquest of Carthage. At other times, defeats were moralized into cautionary tales about individual failings, ensuring that blame was personalized rather than institutional. The disaster at Carrhae, for example, was remembered less as a structural failure of Roman military strategy and more as the personal downfall of Crassus. Roman writers emphasized his insatiable greed, his reckless ambition to equal the glories of Caesar and Pompey, and his poor judgment in trusting false intelligence from the Parthians. By attributing the defeat to Crassus's flaws, Rome protected the broader image of its military system. The empire itself was not at fault. Rather, one man's vices had brought disaster. In this way, Rome avoided confronting systemic weaknesses and instead absorbed the defeat into its moral discourse. Carrhae became a parable, a demonstration of how hubris and greed led to ruin. The shame of military failure was displaced onto the character of the defeated commander, leaving Rome's larger narrative of martial supremacy untouched. The same was true of the Varian disaster in the Teutoburg forest. The massacre of 3 legions might have signaled a serious vulnerability in Rome's imperial project. But instead of openly confronting its implications, Roman memory reshaped the story into a tale of betrayal and misjudgment. Verus.
The orchestration of memory did not end with how defeats were reframed in words. They extended into the very fabric of Rome's public spaces, monuments, and rituals. Victories were paraded in triumphs, immortalized in inscriptions, and carved into marble reliefs. While defeats were denied, a stage excluded from the monumental landscape of the city. This imbalance was deliberate, for public memory in Rome was inseparable from its visual environment. Citizens walking through the Forum or along the Via Sacra encountered daily reminders of Rome's martial dominance, but no markers of its humiliations. The silence of stone was as important as the speech of historians, ensuring that the city itself told only one story. Rome was a theater of victory, and the absence of defeat was a performance in its own right. The Roman triumph encapsulated this selective memory in its purest form. Generals who returned victorious from war were granted the honor of parading through the city, displaying spoils, captives, and emblems of conquest before cheering crowds. These triumphs were carefully staged spectacles, designed to affirm the general's glory, and by extension, Rome's destiny as a conqueror. No similar ritual existed for defeats. The legions lost at Carrhae or Teutoburg were not mourned publicly in ritualized form. Their memory was left unacknowledged. The triumph became a ritual of erasure as much as celebration. By focusing on victories, it implicitly buried defeats, denying them space in the collective imagination. Citizens cheered for conquest, and in the absence of counter-narratives, they absorbed the illusion of Rome's unbroken supremacy. Monuments, too, served this function. Triumphal arches, victory columns, and temples dedicated to Mars or Jupiter celebrated the fruits of successful campaigns, ensuring that military glory was literally carved into the skyline. The column of Trajan, for instance, spirals upward with depictions of his victories in Dacia, a visual narrative of conquest that proclaimed Rome's power to all who gazed upon it. But where were the monuments to the fallen legions, to the lost campaigns? They were absent by design. The physical landscape of Rome presented a curated version of history, one in which only triumph endured. When monuments acknowledged hardships such as the sacrifices of soldiers, they did so within the context of victory, never failure. Thus, defeat vanished, not only from rhetoric, but from the physical memoriscape of the empire. Coins reinforced this selective vision on a more intimate scale. Minted in the millions and circulated throughout the empire, coins were miniature monuments, carrying the faces of emperors and symbols of conquest. They proclaimed victories in Parthia, Britain, or Dacia, often with inscriptions like Victoria, Augusti, or Imperator. Nowhere did coins commemorate lost battles or dead legions. By placing victory literally into the hands of citizens, Rome created a constant reminder of its martial supremacy. In the daily exchanges of commerce, people touched, saw, and passed along the empire's chosen narrative. Silence about defeat was not just political lit, it was economic, built into the currency of life. Theaters and arenas also became sites where Rome's military mythology was staged and reinforced. Gladiatorial games, mock naval battles, and staged recreations of Roman victories reminded audiences of their empire's strength. Enemies were paraded and humiliated, exotic animals slain, and martial values celebrated before thousands of spectators. These spectacles, like triumphs and monuments, projected victory while suppressing defeat. The people of Rome saw their empire dominate endlessly in performance, even if reality was more complex. It didn't matter what had happened, only what was shown to have happened. The stage became another site of memory management, where the empire rehearsed its invincibility for the benefit of its own citizens. By saturating public life with the imagery of conquest and denying space to failure, Rome created a memory system that left little room for alternative stories. Defeats could occur in reality, but in the imagination of the people, the empire remained unbroken. This asymmetry between triumph and silence was not an oversight but a calculated strategy, ensuring that Rome's authority rested on the illusion of permanence. If a citizen asked what Rome was, they needed only to look around. Monuments, coins, festivals, and rituals all proclaimed the same message. Rome was destined to win. In this way, the manipulation of memory was not just intellectual, but visceral, inscribed into the very spaces and objects that defined daily life. Rome became not merely an empire of legions, but an empire of stories with victory written in stone and defeat consigned to silence. The management of military memory was not only a collective cultural phenomenon, but also a deeply personal project for individual emperors. The legitimacy of an emperor often depended on his reputation as a military leader, the supreme commander who embodied Rome's destiny. For this reason, emperors invested extraordinary effort in shaping the stories told about their campaigns, ensuring that successes were amplified and failures diminished. Our first glimpse into this practice comes from the earliest emperors. Augustus, the first emperor, offers perhaps the clearest example of this careful curation. His Res Gesta Devi Augusti, an autobiographical inscription set up across the empire, proudly lists his victories, his gifts to the people, and the territories brought under Roman sway. Yet the humiliating defeats suffered under his reign, such as the disaster in the Teutoburg forest in 09 CE, are conspicuously absent. The legions lost in Germany are not denied outright, but they are quietly excluded, swallowed by the silence of the text. Instead, Augustus emphasizes his diplomatic recovery of Roman standards from the Parthians, presenting negotiation as triumph and transforming what might have been seen as weakness into a masterstroke of imperial prestige. Trajan, too, demonstrates the personal stakes of memory management. His Dacian campaigns were bloody, costly, and prolonged, yet the narrative preserved in Rome is one of unqualified victory. The Column of Trajan, a towering monument spiraling with detailed reliefs, shows the emperor leading his men, receiving the submission of Dacian leaders, and presiding over ceremonies of conquest. Nowhere on the column do we see the moments of Roman struggle, the ambushes, the setbacks, the soldiers who fell in droves on foreign soil. By curating victory in stone, Trajan ensured that the story told in perpetuity was one of Roman power and inevitability. The column, visible in the heart of Rome, became a permanent propaganda tool, shaping the way citizens and visitors alike understood his reign. Even centuries later, historians must reckon with the overwhelming dominance of this narrative, piecing together glimpses of hardship from scattered sources overshadowed by the triumphant reliefs. Hadrian offers yet another variation on this theme, one that shows the subtler forms of erasure. Unlike Trajan, Hadrian did not pursue aggressive conquest. Indeed, he pulled back from some of his predecessors' expansions. Yet in public memory, he is remembered not as the emperor who abandoned territories, but as the one who consolidated the empire's strength. His construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britain, for example, is presented as a symbol of power and control, a visible marker of Rome's enduring dominance at the edge of the known world. The retreat from Trajan's conquests in Mesopotamia is muted, reframed as strategic prudence rather than defeat. In this way, Hadrian demonstrates how silence could be paired with rebranding. What might have been remembered as withdrawal was instead immortalized as wise defense. His reign, like those before him, shows that emperors were not merely rulers of armies, but curators of narrative, shaping memory as carefully as they shaped laws or buildings. Even emperors who struggled militarily sought to spin failure into legitimacy. Marcus Aurelius, revered as a philosopher king, fought exhausting campaigns along the Danube that drained resources and cost countless lives. Yet inscriptions and coins frame these conflicts as victories, emphasizing captured prisoners and the submission of barbarian tribes. The reality of constant attrition is absent, replaced by imagery of triumph. Later emperors, such as Septimius Severus, followed the same pattern, using monuments and public rituals to project strength, even when victories were partial or Pyrrhic. What mattered was not the balance of casualties or the durability of conquests, but the story told in Rome itself. This personal dimension underscores a fundamental truth. Rome's emperors understood that power resided not only in legions, but in memory. To lose control of the narrative was to risk losing legitimacy. by silencing defeats, reframing withdrawals, and immortalizing triumphs. Emperors ensured that their reigns would be remembered as golden chapters in the story of Roman destiny. Their propaganda was not simply self-serving, but structural, feeding into the broader cultural machinery that demanded Rome be seen as invincible. And so the cycle continued. Each emperor inherited not only the legions and provinces of his predecessors, but also their obligation to maintain the illusion of unbroken supremacy. Failure could occur on the battlefield, but in memory, it was carefully managed, reshaped into something that would not weaken the imperial myth. The empire endured not only because of its armies, but because of its mastery over what those armies were remembered to have achieved. For modern historians, peeling back the layers of Rome's curated memory is both a challenge and a fascination. The silence surrounding defeats is rarely total. Fragments survive in archaeology, in the records of foreign peoples, or in the reluctant admissions of Roman authors writing generations later. These traces allow us to glimpse the events Rome sought to bury. The Teutoburg disaster, for instance, emerges not only in Roman accounts, but also in archaeological evidence scattered across the forests of modern Germany, where weapons, bones, and remnants of camps tell the story of 3 legions annihilated. The scale of the loss made tangible by these remains contrasts sharply with the muted tone of Roman historians, who often reframed the catastrophe as a temporary setback avenged by later campaigns. Archaeology thus becomes a counter-narrative, preserving what propaganda sought to erase. In other cases, the voices of Rome's enemies survive. Jewish, Parthian, and Germanic sources, though fragmentary, offer glimpses of triumphs over Roman armies that the empire preferred to forget. These alternative accounts remind us that memory is always contested, and that the victors in one place may be the vanquished in another. Some Roman historians themselves occasionally pierce the veil of silence. Tacitus, writing about the Germanic wars, acknowledges the loss of Varus's legions, but frames it within a narrative of eventual Roman recovery. He could not ignore the disaster, but he could embed it in a larger story of resilience and vengeance. Similarly, Cassius Dio describes moments of weakness and defeat, but often in ways that shift blame to unlucky generals or external treachery rather than to Rome itself. These writers walked a fine line, acknowledging failure without undermining the myth of invincibility. The fact that such accounts survive at all is a testament to the difficulty of complete erasure. Even the most powerful regimes cannot fully silence the past. They can only muffle it, distort it, or push it to the margins where attentive readers and researchers may later rediscover it. Modern analysis, too, benefits from examining what is not said as much as what is. When we see long stretches of military silence in Roman sources, we can often suspect that defeats or stalemates lurk in the background. The absence itself becomes evidence, a kind of negative space that speaks volumes. Coins that trumpet victories in one region may conceal failures elsewhere, diverting attention from campaigns that ended poorly. Inscriptions boasting of the submission of foreign kings might, upon closer scrutiny, reveal diplomatic compromises rebranded as conquest. By reading Rome's records critically, listening not only to their words but to their silences, we reconstruct a fuller, messier, and far more human story of the empire's military experience. This reconstruction matters because it reminds us that Rome, despite its grandeur, was not invincible. The empire suffered devastating losses, made costly mistakes, and endured humiliations that threatened its stability. The decision to erase these defeats from memory was not merely about pride, it was about survival. If Rome had been too honest about its failures, it might have undermined the confidence of its citizens, the loyalty of its armies, or the obedience of its provinces. Propaganda was thus a weapon as essential as the gladius, one wielded not on the battlefield but in the realm of collective memory. The true dark secret of Rome's erasure of defeats is that it worked so effectively for so long, convincing contemporaries and even shaping the assumptions of later generations who inherited the myth of Rome's eternal triumph. And yet, in recovering these hidden stories, we do not merely expose propaganda, we restore humanity to the Roman past. Defeats show us legions overwhelmed by unfamiliar terrain, soldiers broken by exhaustion, commanders blinded by arrogance. They remind us that Rome's greatness was never effortless, but always precarious, sustained by choices, gambles, and luck, as much as by discipline and organization. By unearthing these buried defeats, we see Rome not as an invincible monolith, but as a society of human beings, struggling, failing, and persevering. The erasures that once served imperial power thus become opportunities for modern reflection, teaching us not only about Rome's illusions, but also about the universal human tendency to curate memory. In recognizing what Rome tried to hide, we come closer to understanding the empire in its entirety, its triumphs and its humiliations alike. If Rome's manipulation of memory in politics and warfare seems calculating, its approach to religion and culture reveals an equally dark, though subtler, dimension of erasure. The Roman world was a mosaic of gods, cults, rituals, and traditions inherited from countless conquered peoples. On the surface, Rome appeared tolerant, absorbing foreign deities into its pantheon and allowing local practices to continue alongside official state cults. But beneath this veneer of inclusivity lay a careful system of control. When a religion or cultural practice was deemed harmless or even useful, it was embraced, Romanized, and woven into the imperial narrative. But when a cult, belief system, or tradition threatened the unity, authority, or moral vision of Rome, it was subject to suppression, distortion, or outright obliteration. This process of erasure, though less visible than the chiseling of names or the rewriting of military records, was no less effective. Through selective memory, Rome shaped not only how its citizens thought of their gods, but also how entire cultures would be remembered or forgotten. One of the most striking examples of this dynamic can be seen in the treatment of so-called foreign cults. Some, like the worship of Isis from Egypt or Mithras from Persia, were eventually accommodated and even flourished in Rome, their imagery appearing in household shrines and imperial monuments alike. Their survival was possible because Rome found ways to domesticate them, to present them as compatible with the empire's broader values. Yet others faced a different fate. The Druids of Gaul and Britain, for instance, were systematically targeted. Roman writers like Tacitus described their rituals often with an air of horror, emphasizing alleged human sacrifices as barbaric and dangerous. Whether or not such practices were widespread, the portrayal justified Rome's campaign of suppression. Sacred groves were cut down, druidic centers destroyed, and their traditions erased from the cultural memory of the empire. Today, much of what we think we know about the Druids comes through the filter of Roman hostility, records shaped less by preservation than by propaganda. Their voices were silenced, their practices extinguished, leaving only a caricature designed to highlight Rome's supposed superiority. This pattern of selective erasure also extended to Judaism, one of the most stubbornly resistant religious traditions Rome ever encountered. Unlike the Druids, Jews were not eradicated, but their repeated revolts against Roman rule prompted brutal reprisals. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, Rome not only crushed the rebellion militarily, but also sought to reshape the memory of the Jewish people within the empire. The Arch of Titus in Rome still stands as a triumphal monument, depicting Roman soldiers carrying off sacred objects from the temple as symbols of conquest. For Romans walking beneath it, the message was clear. The gods of the Jews had been defeated, their rituals absorbed into Rome's story of dominance. In later centuries, under emperors like Hadrian, Jewish practices were further curtailed, and even the name of Jerusalem was erased, replaced with Aelia Capitolina. In this case, erasure was both cultural and geographical, an attempt to overwrite identity itself. Yet ironically, such efforts preserved memory in a twisted way. By making Judaism a symbol of resistance and resilience, even as Rome tried to silence it. What these examples reveal is that Rome's erasure of religion and culture was not simply about removing inconvenient practices, but about rewriting them into narratives that served imperial authority. The Druids were remembered not as spiritual leaders, but as bloodthirsty savages defeated by Roman civilization. The Jews were depicted not as a people with a long and complex tradition, but as rebels crushed under the weight of imperial might. Even tolerated cults were reframed, their foreignness domesticated until they appeared as part of Rome's destiny to unite the world under its gods and laws. Memory, once again, became a battlefield, this time not of armies but of beliefs. And as in politics and war, Rome proved adept at ensuring that its version of the story endured. While alternative voices faded into obscurity, among all the religions that came into conflict with Rome, none illustrates the paradox of erasure more powerfully than Christianity. In its earliest days, Christianity was just one among many small sects in the empire, often indistinguishable from Judaism in the eyes of Roman officials. But as it grew, it attracted suspicion for its refusal to honor the Roman gods and, most dangerously, its rejection of the emperor cult, the practice of regarding the emperor as divine. To worship Christ exclusively meant refusing to burn incense to Jupiter or to swear loyalty in religious form to the emperor, acts that Rome interpreted as treasonous. The response was swift and brutal. Waves of persecution, sporadic but ferocious, swept across the empire. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in public spectacles meant to serve as warnings. Their scriptures were ordered burned, their leaders hunted, their communities scattered. Rome sought not only to destroy Christians physically, but also to erase them culturally, ensuring that future generations would remember them, if at all, as criminals and traitors. Yet the attempt at erasure backfired in spectacular fashion. Persecution, intended to extinguish Christianity, instead gave it martyrs, figures whose steadfastness under torture became stories too powerful to suppress. Accounts of men and women who faced wild beasts in the arena, or who sang hymns while being burned alive, spread through whispered networks, inspiring others to join the faith. Rome's effort to silence Christianity ended up amplifying it, transforming what might have remained a marginal sect into a movement defined by resilience. The very silence Rome tried to impose was filled by the voices of those who refused to deny their beliefs, even at the cost of death. The erasure that was supposed to wipe them from memory became paradoxically the reason they were remembered. The intellectual side of suppression was equally striking. Roman officials sometimes mocked Christian texts as absurd or dangerous, attempting to discredit them. Libraries, temples, and archives excluded or destroyed Christian writings where possible, ensuring that Rome's cultural institutions reflected the empire's preferred beliefs. And yet, the resilience of Christian communities meant that texts survived in hidden copies, passed from hand to hand. By the 4th century, these once suppressed writings had become the foundation of an entire counterculture within the empire. In the end, the attempt to erase these scriptures only sharpened their significance, endowing them with the aura of forbidden truth. Rome's libraries might have rejected them, but the people preserved them, ensuring their eventual triumph over official silence. The reversal is one of history's most striking ironies. By the early 4th century under Constantine, Christianity had not only survived attempts at erasure, but had emerged as the favored religion of the empire itself. Beyond Christianity and Judaism, Rome also wielded erasure as a weapon against the many local gods, cults, and traditions that dotted its provinces. Each conquered region had its own pantheon, sacred places and rituals, rooted in centuries of identity. For Rome, these traditions posed both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, they could be co-opted local gods reinterpreted as equivalents of Roman deities, their temples folded into the empire's religious landscape. On the other hand, when a cult was tied too closely to resistance, or when its practices stood in sharp contrast to Roman order, it became a target for suppression. This dual approach, absorb or erase, was central to how Rome consolidated cultural dominance, ensuring that local memory bent toward the empire rather than standing apart from it. The result was a patchwork of survival and silence, where some traditions thrived in Roman disguise, while others vanished almost entirely, remembered only through the distorted lens of Roman hostility. Carthage offers one of the starkest examples. After its final defeat in 146 BCE, the city was razed, its population scattered or enslaved, and its gods demonized. Roman writers painted Carthaginian religion as cruel, accusing it of child sacrifice to deities like Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. Whether these accusations reflected reality or were exaggerated propaganda, they served their purpose. They justified Rome's destruction of Carthage and its claim that Roman conquest had brought moral improvement. The Carthaginian gods were not integrated into Rome's pantheon but vilified. Their temples destroyed, their memory preserved only as a warning of barbarism. Today, much of what we know about Carthaginian religion is filtered through Roman contempt. meaning that an entire cultural system was not only silenced, but also rewritten as an indictment against itself. The erasure was so effective that it took centuries of archaeology to recover even fragments of Carthaginian practice. Even now, the shadow of Rome's propaganda lingers over scholarly debate. Egypt tells a slightly different story, one of both absorption and erasure. The gods of Egypt fascinated the Romans, and figures like Isis and Serapis eventually found enthusiastic followings in Rome itself. Yet, this selective adoption coexisted with targeted suppression. Temples of Isis were alternately tolerated and destroyed depending on the political climate, reflecting the empire's unease with her popularity among marginalized groups. Moreover, when Christianity eventually rose to dominance, it was Egyptian temples that suffered some of the most visible acts of religious erasure. The Great Temple of Serapis in Alexandria was destroyed in 391 CE. Its ruins a symbol of Rome's shifting religious power. What survived of Egyptian tradition often did so in heavily Romanized forms, stripped of their original context and integrated into a framework that emphasized Rome's authority over even the most ancient civilizations. Thus, Egyptian gods lived on, but often not as Egyptians had known them, rather as Romanized shadows molded to fit imperial needs. In Gaul and other Celtic regions, Rome's approach once again balanced tolerance with obliteration. Local gods were often paired with Roman equivalents: Mars, with a Celtic war god; Mercury, with a local deity of trade, creating hybrid forms that made Roman religion feel familiar, while also diluting the uniqueness of indigenous traditions. Yet, where resistance emerged, suppression followed. Sacred groves were cut down, altars destroyed, and priests eliminated, ensuring that local cults lost their independent authority. Over generations, the hybridized gods replaced the old, and memory of purely Celtic practices faded. The process was gradual and insidious. Erasure achieved not through immediate destruction, but through slow assimilation, until the original tradition was nearly indistinguishable from its Roman counterpart. What ties these examples together is Rome's relentless insistence that cultural memories serve its authority. To remember Carthage as pious or noble was unacceptable, had to be remembered as cruel and defeated. To revere Egyptian gods independently of Rome was dangerous, had to be reframed as Roman-friendly, their temples regulated by imperial oversight. To worship Celtic deities outside of Roman categories risked fostering rebellion, had to be domesticated until they looked Roman themselves. Erasure, in these cases, was not always about silence, but about distortion. By rewriting memory, Rome ensured that the diversity of its empire did not fracture into competing identities, but bent toward a single imperial narrative. The gods of the provinces could live on only if they bowed to Rome, and in bowing, they lost part of their essence. In this way, entire cultures were reshaped, remembered not as they were, but as Rome wanted them to be. Architecture, perhaps more than any other medium, was the stage upon which Rome performed its power of cultural erasure. Temples, shrines, and sacred spaces were never neutral in the ancient world. They embodied the identity of communities, serving as the physical anchors of memory, belief, and tradition. Rome understood this with extraordinary clarity, and had used architecture as both a tool of suppression and a vehicle for rewriting the past. When Rome destroyed or appropriated a sacred site, it was not merely demolishing stone. It was severing a community's connection to its gods and replacing that connection with imperial authority. The message was unmistakable. The gods of others were either powerless against Rome or subordinate to Rome's own divine order. Through this architectural manipulation, Rome not only erased the sacred geography of conquered peoples, but also inscribed its own story in its place, ensuring that future generations would walk amidst monuments that proclaimed the empire's supremacy. The destruction of temples was a particularly blunt instrument of erasure. In Carthage, sacred sites were leveled, their stones repurposed for Roman buildings, ensuring that the city's spiritual landscape was permanently altered. In Judea, the temple in Jerusalem, one of the most significant religious structures in the ancient world, was burned and dismantled by Roman legions in 70 C. Its treasures were carried to Rome, paraded in triumph, and displayed as spoils of war. The temple itself was replaced by the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the same site, a deliberate act of overwriting one sacred geography with another. The physical landscape of worship was thus transformed into a symbol of conquest, the erasure not only of a building, but of the memory of what that building had represented to its people. For Jews, the loss of the temple became a wound carried through centuries. For Romans, it was a demonstration that their gods had triumphed. Equally potent was the Roman practice of architectural appropriation, taking over existing temples and rededicating them to Roman deities or emperors. This form of erasure was subtler than destruction, but in many ways just as effective. By keeping the structure, but altering its meaning, Rome imposed a new narrative onto old stones. A temple once dedicated to a local god might suddenly bear the image of Jupiter, or an inscription honoring Augustus. The community might still gather there, but the rituals and symbols had been reshaped, aligning worship with Roman identity. The original purpose of the building slowly faded from memory, replaced by the Roman version inscribed on its walls. Over generations, the act of appropriation blurred the line between preservation and suppression, making it difficult for later historians and even for the descendants of the worshippers to distinguish where one tradition ended and the other began. Renaming sacred spaces was another weapon in Rome's arsenal. Place names carried enormous symbolic weight, linking geography to memory and identity. By renaming conquered cities, sanctuaries, and landscapes, Rome erased the linguistic markers of local belief and replaced them with Roman associations. Gay Resiciations, renamed Aelia Capitolina by Hadrian, is one of the most famous examples. The new name honored the emperor's family in Jupiter Capitolinus, Rome's chief deity, forcibly inscribing Roman authority onto a city that had resisted imperial control. Such acts were not limited to Judea. Across the empire, local names were replaced by Romanized ones, ensuring that maps, inscriptions, and official records reflected Rome's dominance. The old names lingered in oral memory. But in the written and monumental recorder, the record that endured, they were systematically overwritten. Monuments, too, became instruments of rewriting. Victory arches, columns, and forums celebrated Rome's gods and emperors while often standing on the ruins of what had come before. The Arch of Titus, for instance, immortalized the conquest of Judea and the destruction of its temple, not only recording the event, but ensuring that future generations would remember it in Rome's terms. Such monuments projected permanence, declaring Rome's narrative as the one that would outlast the centuries, and in many cases, they succeeded. Today, the Arch of Titus still towers in Rome, a reminder of how architecture can serve as propaganda that endures long after the empire itself has fallen. In these ways, architecture was transformed into a weapon of memory, where destruction eliminated, appropriation redefined, and renaming overwrote. The empire left behind landscapes that told only the Roman version of events. Travelers, citizens, and future historians alike encountered spaces that had been carefully curated, their original meanings erased or buried beneath layers of imperial symbolism. The dark secret of Rome's architectural dominance is not merely that it built marvels of engineering, but that it used those marvels to silence the voices of others, ensuring that memory itself became part of Rome's empire. If architecture reshaped the physical landscape of memory, literature and philosophy were the battlegrounds upon which Rome contested the intellectual, spiritual heritage of its subjects. Ideas, after all, were as dangerous as armies, perhaps more so, because they could inspire resistance, unify communities, and endure beyond the destruction of cities. Rome was acutely aware of the power of written words, oral traditions, and philosophical teachings, and it devoted immense energy to suppressing, appropriating, or co-opting those currents of thought that threatened its authority. What we see in the historical record is not a neutral transmission of knowledge, but a heavily filtered one, curated by the victors, who chose which texts to preserve and which to consign to oblivion. The silences in our libraries, the missing voices in our philosophical canon, are themselves evidence of Rome's quiet campaign of intellectual erasure. Censorship was one of the most obvious tools of control. Works that directly challenged imperial power could be banned, destroyed, or publicly burned. Authors who mocked emperors or questioned Rome's authority were punished with exile, imprisonment, or execution. The poet Ovid's mysterious banishment under Augustus remains one of the most famous examples, though the precise cause is debated. Many scholars suspect that his writings were deemed politically or morally dangerous to the Augustan regime. Ovid's works survived in part because copies had already spread, but others were not so fortunate. Countless texts by lesser-known authors vanished when imperial edicts demanded their destruction. We know of them only through fragments, hostile references, or the tantalizing mention of a title in another writer's work. Their disappearance reminds us that what we call Roman literature is not a complete picture of the past, but rather the curated remains of what Rome allowed to endure. Philosophy, too, faced scrutiny and reshaping. Certain schools of thought, such as Stoicism, were tolerated or even co-opted because they could be reframed to support imperial ideals of duty, order, and endurance. Others, however, were treated with suspicion. Epicureanism, which emphasized pleasure and personal freedom, often clashed with Roman ideals of civic duty and was subject to suppression. More threatening still were philosophies that carried political implications, such as those promoting republican liberty in an age of autocracy. Teachers who encouraged students to question authority or exalted freedom as a natural right risked persecution. The philosopher Seneca himself, though a tutor to Nero, was eventually forced to take his own life when accused of conspiracy. His fate illustrates the dangerous tightrope intellectuals walked in Rome. Even those closest to power were vulnerable if their ideas or simply their influence became inconvenient to the regime. Religious texts were a particular target. In Judea, scrolls and sacred writings were seized or destroyed during Rome's wars with Jewish rebels. These losses, though partly preserved through later rabbinical traditions, present a catastrophic erasure of cultural memory. Similarly, in Egypt, while Rome marveled at and sometimes absorbed aspects of its ancient wisdom, it also oversaw the decline of native traditions, ensuring that Hellenistic and Roman frameworks dominated the intellectual landscape. The famous Library of Alexandria, though its destruction occurred in stages over centuries, symbolizes this loss. A repository of knowledge that, had it survived intact, might have given us a vastly different picture of the ancient world. Whether through deliberate acts of suppression or neglect under Roman rule, countless texts vanished, and with them, the voices of entire civilizations were muted. Even the works Rome chose to preserve were often reshaped. Copyists and historians inserted pro-Roman commentary or reframed narratives to align with imperial ideology. Inscriptions and records were edited to erase names of disgraced individuals, while entire treatises could be redacted to emphasize loyalty to Rome. Thus, what appears to us as authentic transmission may in fact be a palimpsest, a layered rewriting in which original meanings were obscured or reinterpreted. The intellectual legacy we inherit is therefore not a neutral collection of ideas, but one sifted through the filters of censorship, appropriation, and propaganda. The tragedy of this erasure is not only the loss of individual works, but the silencing of alternative perspectives that could have offered us richer understandings of the ancient world. The philosophies that survived often did so because they could be bent to Rome's purposes, while those that might have challenged its authority were deliberately buried. What remains is a curated canon that reflects Rome's priorities more than the full diversity of ancient thought. In this way, Rome's control over literature and philosophy ensured that even in the realm of ideas, its enemies were erased, their voices drowned out by the chorus of imperial approval. If written texts could be seized and burned, oral traditions posed a subtler challenge for Rome, yet one no less significant. Spoken heritage songs, myths, epics, and stories told by word of mouth was the lifeblood of many conquered peoples, particularly those with limited literacy or with traditions that prized oral recitation over writing. Rome recognized that as long as communities continued to tell their stories, they preserved identities that resisted assimilation. To counter this, Rome employed strategies aimed at silencing or reshaping oral culture, often by imposing Latin as the language of administration, education, and public life. Language itself became an instrument of erasure. For once a people's words were supplanted by another tongue, the memory encoded in their songs and stories began to fade. The dominance of Latin, enforced by institutions and reinforced by prestige, gradually eroded the linguistic foundations upon which oral traditions depended. The suppression of local languages was not always violent. It was systemic and generational. In Gaul, for example, Celtic languages gave way to Latin through the establishment of schools. The presence of Roman settlers and the use of Latin in trade and law, within a few centuries, much of the oral literature of the Celts, including myths, epic poetry, and ritual chants, had been lost or preserved only in fragments recorded later by outsiders. The same process unfolded across North Africa, where Punic, the language of Carthage, was steadily displaced until it vanished almost entirely. With the loss of these languages came the loss of countless oral tradition stories of heroes, genealogies of clans, wisdom passed down through proverbs and songs, all dissolved into silence because Rome made no effort to preserve them. The absence we feel in our historical record is not accidental. It is the result of systemic erasure that privileged Latin while letting local voices wither. Religious rituals themselves often carried oral components, chants, prayers, and invocations that were performed communally. When Rome suppressed foreign cults or destroyed temples, it also extinguished these spoken practices. Without spaces to gather and without official sanction, the rituals of minority faiths could not be performed openly. In some cases, Rome permitted foreign gods to be integrated into its pantheon, but only after reshaping their worship into forms that fit Roman expectations. What was once a living oral tradition became ritualized under imperial oversight, with the spontaneity and creativity of local voices subdued. Over time, the chants and prayers of conquered peoples either disappeared or were absorbed so thoroughly into Roman ritual that their origins were obscured. Oral traditions, fluid and ephemeral by nature, proved particularly vulnerable to this kind of appropriation and erasure. Festivals and public performances were also targeted. Theatrical plays, epic recitations, and communal storytelling gatherings were not merely entertainment. They were mechanisms for transmitting history, values, and identity. Rome replaced these with spectacles of its own gladiatorial games, triumphal parades, and theatrical performances that glorified emperors or Roman myths. By flooding the cultural space with Roman narratives, the empire marginalized local traditions until they struggled to compete for attention. Over generations, the collective memory of communities shifted, their stories supplanted by Rome's oral traditions, which once defined communal identity, became faint echoes beneath the roar of imperial propaganda. Even in education, oral instruction was reshaped. Roman schools taught rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy through the lens of imperial ideology, training elites in the use of Latin while discouraging the use of local tongues. The children of conquered elites were often sent to Rome for education, ensuring that the next generation of leaders spoke, thought, and argued in Roman terms. Oral traditions passed down through families were increasingly sidelined, as children returned home speaking Latin, quoting Virgil, and identifying with Roman narratives. The empire's reach extended not just into politics and temples, but into the intimate spaces of memory and language, severing ties between generations and diluting the oral culture that had sustained communities for centuries. The fragility of oral traditions makes their erasure particularly devastating. Unlike texts or monuments, oral culture leaves little behind when it is silenced. What Rome destroyed by suppressing languages, replacing rituals, and overwhelming communities with its own narratives, is therefore immeasurable. We can only glimpse fragments of what was lost, echoes preserved in later writings, distorted memories recorded by outsiders, or scattered folktales that survived against the odds. The silence that dominates so many corners of ancient history is itself Rome's legacy, a testament to its relentless effort to not merely defeat enemies on the battlefield, but to erase them from memory itself. As we turn to the legacy of Rome's erasure, it is important to recognize that the empire's efforts to manipulate memory did not end with the fall of its political power. In many ways, the techniques of damnatio memoria, censorship, architectural appropriation, and the silencing of oral traditions set precedents that echoed across later civilizations, shaping how rulers, states, and empires have treated their enemies ever since. The dark secrets behind Rome's erasure of its opponents are not just episodes buried in antiquity. They are the foundation stones of strategies that have been repeated, refined, and reimagined throughout history. When we look around the modern world at governments that censor dissenting voices, topple statues, rename streets, or rewrite textbooks, we are witnessing the shadows of Roman practices. Rome's genius lay not only in its military conquests, but in its capacity to control narratives, a legacy that remains with us even in the 21st century. The clearest expression of this continuity lies in the idea that power is inseparable from memory. Rome demonstrated that victory was incomplete if the defeated could still be remembered with honor or affection. By erasing their names, defacing their images, or suppressing their voices, Rome ensured that its enemies would not become martyrs or symbols of resistance. This logic has persisted through time. Medieval monarchs facing rebellion often ordered the destruction of documents that legitimized rival claims. Modern dictators have manipulated photographs to remove political opponents, echoing the chiseling away of names from Roman inscriptions. Even democratic societies, which often pride themselves on openness, have engaged in selective forgetting, glossing over uncomfortable episodes in their histories or reshaping them into more palatable forms. In every case, the impulse can be traced back to Rome's realization that memory itself is a battlefield. The fact that so many of Rome's erasures are still invisible to us today underscores their effectiveness. We speak of figures like Caligula, Nero, or Commodus, because their notoriety survived the attempts to tarnish them. But how many others have we lost entirely, their names scraped from stone, their works consigned to ash, their voices extinguished by censorship? The gaps in our knowledge, those blank spaces where alternative stories might have been, a testament to Rome's success. In this sense, Rome continues to shape our understanding of the past not only by what it preserved, but by what it destroyed. Our image of antiquity is already Rome's curated vision, distorted by the very tools of erasure we are trying to examine. That realization forces us to confront the limitations of history itself. We are always working with fragments. Silence is as telling as the words that remain. The legacy of Roman erasure also complicates the way we think about empire and civilization. Rome is often celebrated for its contributions to law, engineering, art, and governance. Yet behind those achievements lies a darker truth. That much of Rome's cultural dominance was achieved not by creativity alone, but by systematically silencing the voices of others. When we admire Roman architecture, we must remember the temples torn down to make way for it. When we study Latin literature, we must imagine the works that were deliberately excluded from survival. To honor Rome's achievements without acknowledging its erasures is to accept a sanitized version of history precisely, the kind of selective memory Rome itself sought to impose. The empire's legacy is therefore double-edged. It gave the world much, but it also took much away, often in ways we cannot even measure. The endurance of these practices suggests something profoundly human about the desire to control memory. Rome may have perfected the mechanisms, but the impulse transcends time and culture. To erase an enemy is to try to control not only the present but the future, shaping how generations yet unborn will understand the past. That is the ultimate prize for any ruler, and it is why Rome invested so much effort in practices that at first glance might seem petty, chipping names off inscriptions, ordering the burning of books, renaming cities. These were not trivial acts. They were profound interventions in the fabric of history itself. By controlling memory, Rome ensured that its narrative would dominate, even centuries after its fall. One of the most fascinating aspects of Rome's erasures is the way modern historians, archaeologists, and scholars attempt to reverse them, piecing together the fragments of memory that the empire tried so hard to obliterate. Every broken inscription, every palimpsest manuscript, every half-buried ruin carries within it the possibility of restoring voices once thought silenced. In this way, the very methods of destruction Rome employed, chiseling out names, overwriting texts, repurposing stones, have left behind traces that, paradoxically, now serve as clues. By studying what is missing, we can sometimes glimpse what was erased. The irony is that Rome, as attempts at total control, often created patterns of absence so conspicuous that later generations could detect them. What was once meant to disappear has instead become a puzzle, one that modern scholarship works tirelessly to solve. Consider inscriptions that bear the scars of damnatio memoria. In many cases, the chiseling away of a name is obvious. The stone surface rough where once letters stood. These scars are not mere blank spaces. They are evidence of intent, showing that someone deliberately tried to erase memory. By comparing multiple inscriptions, historians can often reconstruct the missing name. For example, coins or inscriptions that escaped alteration in remote provinces sometimes preserve what was destroyed in Rome. Thus, we can piece together the identity of emperors or rivals who officially ceased to exist. The paradox is striking. The more Rome sought to destroy, the more it left visible wounds in the historical record, and those wounds now speak louder than silence ever could. The act of erasure has become a kind of unintended preservation. Manuscripts, too, tell stories of survival against suppression. In the Middle Ages, many parchment codices were scraped clean and reused for new writings, a practice known as palimpsesting. While this destroyed the original text, modern imaging technologies have allowed scholars to recover the faint underlayers of erased words. Some of these hidden texts include works from antiquity, glimpses of writings that Rome or its successors deemed expendable or dangerous. The survival of such fragments underscores the resilience of memory. Even when deliberately obliterated, traces often linger, waiting to be rediscovered. Each recovered sentence feels like an act of defiance across centuries, as if the lost author whispers back against Rome's attempt to silence them. Archaeology provides another avenue of recovery. Temples rededicated to Roman gods sometimes retain architectural features that reveal their earlier purpose. Beneath churches in Rome and other cities, archaeologists have uncovered layers of earlier shrines, often belonging to suppressed religions or local cults. These layers are like geological strata of memory, showing how Rome built its narrative literally on top of others. Excavations in Carthage, Judea, and Britain have unearthed remnants of native cultures that Rome attempted to erase. Pottery styles, burial practices, and inscriptions in local languages all testify to the resilience of communities beneath the weight of Roman dominance. Though Rome sought to overwrite these identities, archaeology proves that they were never entirely lost. Even in the realm of oral tradition, traces endure. Folk tales, myths, and cultural practices in regions once under Roman rule sometimes preserve echoes of pre-Roman traditions. Scholars of Celtic mythology, for instance, rely heavily on medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts written centuries after Rome. This influenced to reconstruct what might have been lost in Gaul. While fragmentary and distorted, these stories hint at a richness that Rome tried to suppress. Similarly, rabbinical writings preserve memory of Jewish traditions that survived Rome's destruction of the temple, ensuring that even the empire's most determined erasures could not extinguish all voices. Oral traditions, though fragile, have shown remarkable resilience, surviving where monuments crumbled and texts perished. The modern recovery of these voices is more than academic curiosity. It is a form of resistance against Rome's attempted control of history. Each name reconstructed, each fragment restored, each forgotten story brought back into the light, challenges the empire's old claim to define what should be remembered. The legacy of erasure is twofold. It reveals Rome's determination to dominate memory, but it also inspires modern efforts to reclaim and honor the silenced. The gaps in our knowledge may never be fully filled, but every recovered voice adds richness to the tapestry of history, reminding us that no empire's control is ever absolute. Rome's mastery of erasure did not vanish with the collapse of its empire. Rather, it laid down patterns that were eagerly adopted by later powers. The Byzantine Empire, which styled itself as the true continuation of Rome, inherited not only its legal and administrative structures, but also its tools of memory control. Byzantine rulers practiced their own versions of damnatio memoria, erasing disgraced officials from inscriptions and rewriting chronicles to reflect political victories. Just as Roman emperors had sought to ensure their enemies were forgotten, Byzantine emperors used history writing as propaganda, turning chronicles into instruments of legitimacy. Even the survival of ancient texts was filtered through this lens. Scribes in Byzantine scriptoria chose what to copy and preserve, ensuring that works aligned with Christian orthodoxy flourished, while others languished or disappeared entirely. In this way, Rome's model of selective preservation endured, shaping not only what Byzantium remembered, but also what the broader world would inherit from antiquity. Medieval Europe carried forward these practices as well. Kings and popes frequently ordered the destruction of heretical writings, echoing Rome's suppression of dangerous philosophies and religions. The Inquisition's book burnings, for example, can be seen as heirs to the Roman instinct to silence dissent, not by debate, but by obliteration. Chronicles written in monasteries often presented events through lenses that exalted certain rulers while vilifying or ignoring their rivals. When dynasties shifted, scribes sometimes revised genealogies to erase inconvenient claims or fabricate connections to illustrious ancestors. These were not random distortions, but conscious acts of memory management. Following Rome's precedent that history itself could be molded to serve the needs of power, the Roman lesson that control of the narrative is as decisive as control of the battlefield was not forgotten in the medieval imagination. Today, the Islamic world, too, echoes of Roman erasure can be discerned, though adapted to new contexts. As caliphates expanded, they inherited the ruins and traditions of lands once ruled by Rome, while Islam developed its own intellectual traditions. Rulers occasionally employed methods similar to those of Rome to delegitimize rivals or suppress heterodox ideas. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates commissioned histories that emphasized their legitimacy, often at the expense of earlier dynasties. Texts that contradicted the official narrative could be marginalized, destroyed, or rewritten. Though the motivations differed from Rome's, rooted more in religious orthodoxy than imperial grandeur, the underlying principle was similar. Memory was to be curated, not left uncontrolled. In the modern era, the parallels become even more striking. Dictators of the 20th century famously manipulated photographs, removing purged figures from official images in a chilling echo of Roman sculptors chiseling faces from reliefs. Joseph Stalin's careful editing of Soviet history books, in which rivals like Leon Trotsky were erased or vilified, follows directly in Rome's footsteps. The techniques differ in technology, but not in spirit. To rewrite the past is to control the present. Even democratic states, which proclaim transparency, have not been immune to selective memory. Colonial powers often portrayed their empires as civilizing missions, glossing over or erasing the violence and exploitation that sustained them. School curricula, monuments, and national holidays often reflect sanitized narratives, suppressing uncomfortable truths. These practices, though sometimes subtle, rest on the same principle. Rome perfected that. What is remembered defines identity, and what is forgotten loses power. The story of Rome's fall is one of empire's inevitable decline, corruption, and barbarian invasion. But the real legacy of Rome is harder to discern amidst the fallen statues and crumbling monuments. It is in the techniques of erasure and control that outlived the empire. Studying Rome's techniques of memory management offers a sobering truth. While the empire fell, its methods of erasure did not. They live on, woven into the fabric of governance and culture across centuries. The empire demonstrated that memory is not merely a passive record of events, but an active field of struggle. Later powers, consciously or not, borrowed from this example, shaping their own histories by adopting strategies of suppression, rewriting, and commemoration. The continuity from Rome to Byzantium, from medieval Europe to modern regimes, reveals that the manipulation of memory is one of Rome's most enduring legacies. To study these patterns is to confront a sobering truth. While Rome fell, its techniques of erasure did not. They live on, woven into the fabric of governance and culture across centuries. The empire demonstrated that memory is not merely a passive record of events, but an active field of struggle. Later powers, consciously or not, borrowed from this example, shaping their own histories by adopting strategies of suppression, rewriting, and commemoration. The continuity from Rome to Byzantium, from medieval Europe to modern regimes, reveals that the manipulation of memory is one of Rome's most enduring legacies. To study these patterns is to confront a sobering truth. While Rome fell, its techniques of erasure did not. They live on, woven into the fabric of governance and culture across centuries. Our age-old debates about statues, monuments, and public memory reveal just how much Rome's legacy of erasure continues to shape human societies. Across the world, communities grapple with the question of what to do with the physical remnants of the past, whether to preserve, reinterpret, or remove them. When statues of slave traders, colonizers, or authoritarian leaders are toppled or relocated, critics sometimes describe the acts as erasing history. Yet in truth, These debates mirror the very dilemmas Rome grappled with 2,000 years ago. Rome knew that monuments were not passive objects. They were powerful conveyors of meaning, shaping how generations remembered the past. By destroying, rededicating, or relocating them, Rome actively curated the landscape of memory. Today, when societies reconsider monuments, they are engaging in that same process, deciding which stories deserve to dominate the public sphere and which should be challenged or removed. The struggle is not a new one. It is part of a long continuum of battles over memory that Rome helped to define. Consider how Rome handled statues of disgraced emperors. When Caligula was assassinated, his statues were smashed, their fragments buried or recycled into new works. When Geta was murdered by his brother Caracalla, his image was meticulously carved out of family portraits, leaving ghostly gaps where his face once was. The purpose was not merely to remove offensive likenesses, but to control how future generations would perceive the past. Modern debates about whether to preserve controversial statues in museums, contextualize them with plaques, or remove them from public spaces echo these ancient practices. In both cases, the question is not whether the past occurred, but how it should be remembered, and what role monuments play in shaping that memory. In the 21st century, the stakes are remarkably similar to those of ancient Rome. Public monuments function as embodiments of collective values, telling communities what to honor and celebrate. When those values shift, the monuments themselves become contested. Rome addressed this by replacing defeated gods with its own, or renaming cities to reflect imperial authority. Today, societies address it by reevaluating statues, renaming streets, and rewriting textbooks. These actions may provoke controversy. They are part of the same human impulse Rome exploited, the desire to align memory with power. To control monuments is to control narratives, and to control narratives is to influence identity. The enduring relevance of this truth is perhaps Rome's most profound and unsettling gift to us. What distinguishes the modern world is our awareness of the process. Unlike Rome, which often erase without acknowledgement, many societies today engage in public debates about the ethics of erasure. Should a monument be removed entirely, or should it be preserved with context to confront uncomfortable truths? Should textbooks gloss over national failures, or should they include them as lessons? These discussions reveal a recognition that memory is constructed and that erasure is never neutral. It always serves a purpose. In this way, Rome's legacy not only lingers, but forces us to confront our responsibilities in handling history. Understanding how Rome curated memory to serve its empire can help us better recognize when similar patterns appear in our own societies. Yet even as we debate monuments and memory, Rome's shadow looms in subtler ways. The gaps it created in history remain unfilled. We may topple a modern statue or revise a textbook, but the names Rome erased, the voices it silenced, and the cultures it suppressed cannot be fully recovered. The loss is permanent, and it reminds us that erasure has consequences that extend far beyond politics. Once memory is destroyed, it cannot simply be replaced. It leaves a void that shapes how future generations perceive the past. That void, crafted deliberately by Rome, is still with us today. Every silence in the historical record, every missing story is a reminder that Rome's manipulation of memory continues to define the boundaries of what we know. Rome's greatest legacy may well be its legacy of erasure. At its core, the question of identity lies at the heart of Rome's legacy of erasure. A society defines itself not only by the stories it tells, but also by the stories it refuses to tell. Rome understood this with ruthless clarity. By silencing the voices of its enemies, Rome shaped not only how those individuals were remembered or forgotten, but also how Romans themselves perceived their place in the world. Citizens of the empire internalized narratives of strength, unity, and inevitability, while the voices of dissent, rebellion, and resistance were pushed to the margins or obliterated altogether. This selective memory produced a culture of pride and cohesion, but it came at the cost of truth. Those who lost to Rome were not merely defeated in battle. They were stripped of their right to be remembered as they truly were. Their identity, in many ways, became whatever Rome allowed to remain. The suppression of Carthage offers a striking example of this dynamic. After the Third Punic War, the Romans not only destroyed the city, but also systematically rewrote the story of their enemy. To Romans, Carthage became a cautionary tale of arrogance and destruction, a city whose wealth and power threatened the world until Rome nobly intervened. Yet Carthaginian voices are almost entirely absent from the record. What would Carthaginians have said about Rome, about their culture, or about their defeat? We will never know. Rome's narrative became the only narrative, shaping not just how future Romans viewed Carthage, but how we do today. Carthage's identity, once complex and vibrant, survives largely as a distorted shadow through the lens of its conqueror. The same fate befell countless peoples absorbed into the Roman Empire, the Gauls and Dacians to the Jews and Britons. The identities of entire nations were redefined by how Rome chose to record them. Some were reduced to stereotypes, barbarians, rebels, savages, while others were absorbed into Rome's self-image as loyal provinces or noble allies. Even emperors could not escape this fate. The erasure of Geta, whose face was carved out of reliefs and whose name was struck from inscriptions, demonstrates how identity itself could be reshaped by memory politics. To the Romans of Caracal's reign, Geta was not a murdered conqueror, but a non-person, erased from official identity and denied a legacy. His existence was reduced to a whispered shadow, an uncomfortable secret in family portraits where his likeness once appeared. Modern societies, of course, wrestle with similar tensions. Nations define themselves by the triumphs they highlight and the failures they minimize. When school curriculums emphasize victories while omitting atrocities, they are participating in the same selective process Rome mastered. When political leaders emphasize unity while discouraging discussion of injustices, they too are crafting a collective identity through omission. The result is an identity that feels strong, but is built upon silence. Much like Rome's, the stories left untold are as important as those repeated endlessly, and the balance between them shapes how communities see themselves in the present. What Rome teaches us is that identity, once shaped by erasure, becomes difficult to disentangle from the silence that defines it. The loss of voices is not temporary. It echoes across centuries. Rome's enemies do not simply lack monuments. They lack representation, perspective, and the ability to claim their own place in history. This distortion continues to affect our understanding of the ancient world and, by extension, the origins of Western civilization. In many ways, we have inherited Rome's version of itself more than the realities of those it conquered. In the end, the dark secrets behind Rome's erasure of its enemies from history remind us of the fragile, constructed nature of memory itself. Rome's rulers and senators understood that power was not only exercised through armies, wealth, or laws, but through the stories people carried in their minds. By rewriting those stories, by chiseling names out of inscriptions, by reworking monuments, by suppressing voices Rome secured not just its dominance in the moment, but its influence across centuries. It shaped how posterity would see not only its rulers and victories, but also its enemies and failures. The result is a historical record filled with dazzling achievements, but riddled with silences, shadows, and deliberate distortions. Those silences are not empty, they are full of meaning, reminding us of the lives and perspectives that were intentionally denied to us. To study Rome is therefore to study not only what survives, but what was lost, not only the stones that remain, but the hands that were erased from the chisels of memory. This recognition carries profound implications for how we understand history today. The practice of damnatio memoria may appear ancient, but in truth, it is a mirror reflecting our own age. Every time a story is omitted from a textbook, every time a community's history is ignored, every time a monument is preserved without context or removed without discussion, we participate in the same struggle Rome perfected, the battle over what is remembered and what is forgotten. To acknowledge Rome's manipulation of memory is to confront the uncomfortable fact that history is not neutral, it is curated, contested, and deeply political. The question then is not whether we will erase, but how we will choose to remember, and with what integrity we will approach that task. If Rome teaches us anything, it is that erasure cannot fully succeed. Even in silence, traces remain, ghostly outlines where names were carved away. Faint mentions in hostile sources, archaeological fragments that whisper of lost voices. These fragments challenge us to read between the lines, to search for what Rome tried to hide. They remind us that erasure, while powerful, is never absolute. The human drive to recover, reinterpret, and reclaim the past is just as enduring as the desire to control it. The persistence of scholars, archaeologists, and storytellers ensures that Rome's secrets, though buried, are never entirely beyond reach. We may not recover every lost voice, but by seeking them, we resist the finality Rome intended. And so as we close this exploration, we must recognize our own role as custodians of memory. Rome wielded erasure as a weapon, but we can choose remembrance as an act of justice. We can amplify silenced voices, question official narratives, and honor the complexity of history rather than the simplicity of propaganda. To do so is to resist the allure of forgetting, to refuse the comfort of Rome's curated version of the past. It is to accept the burden of complexity, the weight of contradiction, and the presence of pain in our shared human story. This choice, difficult though it may be, is the only way to build identities rooted not in silence, but in truth. Rome's story ends not with the glory of marble arches or triumphant inscriptions, but with the awareness that all such monuments are incomplete. They tell us what Rome wanted us to know, but not the full story. The true legacy of Rome's erasures is not only the gaps it left behind, but the challenge it poses to us. Will we accept the curated version of history handed down to us, or will we dig deeper, searching for the voices beneath the silence? The decision is ours, and in that decision lies the difference between repeating Rome's mistakes and transcending them. If memory is power, then remembrance is resistance. And perhaps the greatest lesson Rome can teach us is that to remember fully, honestly and inclusively, is to reclaim humanity itself.